Hello and welcome back to the CNAS 2021 National Security Conference, A New American Security. Today, it's the big moment. It's the grand finale. We are doing our strategy game, Security in the Balance, Gaming the Next Defense Strategy. This is going to be live, unscripted, a virtual strategy game in which we need you, the audience, to be a huge part of it. So before we get to our first speakers, I want to, and I'll be doing this throughout the day, I want to just talk through the logistics of how you participate. It's great to see some people are already in the chat, but in case you don't already know how to be there, please go to conference.cnas.org or cnas.org/live. Those are our two big live platforms. And there is a chat going. In order to participate in the chat, please enter your name. Please use your real name if you can. We prefer to have non-anonymous participants. And within that chat, you'll be able to make comments, ask questions of our contestants of our different teams, and you will also be able to vote. And that is the most important thing today, because we need you to vote on the next national defense strategy. And so you'll see the vote button appear periodically at the bottom right of your screen. So as you enter yourself in the chat and you join it, a vote button will appear. And don't worry, I'll be back to tell you about that a little bit later. The other way you can participate is by going to Twitter or any social media and using the hashtag CNAS 2021. And at the end of today's program, we're going to have a hot wash discussion where we're going to try to incorporate as many audience comments as possible. So again, we're psyched to have the audience be a part of today's event. A little bit more about what's going to happen. So we are going to play a strategy game just like the ones used at the Department of Defense. And in that strategy game, you will be picking 3 different times over 3 different time periods the national defense strategy for the United States. And you're going to be challenged by budget constraints, a dynamic competition from China's military, unforeseen global events, and these are all going to force you to make trade-offs among capacity, capability, readiness, while you're also still trying to achieve your overarching goals. We're going to make it as tough as possible, but it's also going to be a lot of fun. Before we get into more details about the game, though, I want to bring up to the stage CNAS's CEO, Richard Fontaine. This is the grand finale of the conference, Richard, and we've had, I think, an incredible couple of weeks, and we're going to hear from you now and again at the end. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Shai. I'm just going to take a second to first welcome everyone and also welcome the guests that we have who are participating in the game most directly. As Shai mentioned, this game will be made up of individuals from CNAS's Defense Program and some expert guests who are going to be putting together this exercise to explore some of the challenges that are going to shape the Department of Defense's next NDS and its global posture review. This is consonant with work the CNAS Defense Program is and has been doing to look at the challenges central to military competition between the United States and China and Russia and others. And last fall, the Defense Program launched the Gaming Lab at CNAS. It's co-led by Senior Fellow Chris Doherty and Fellow Becca Wasser. This creates these kind of innovative, unclassified games and exercises, the kind of which you'll see a little bit about today on a whole range of challenging national security issues, and pulls together leaders in government, policy, industry, academia to design and conduct these activities and produce some outcomes that may be different than folks thought going in, and bringing people through this kind of intellectual exercise in order to really wrestle with the challenges that any policymaker would face in these areas. So let me just take 1 second to welcome our distinguished guests who will make up the NDS commission for the purposes of our game. They're going to sort of grill our strategists on their approaches to the next national defense strategy. So we have Eric Fanning, who served as the 22nd Secretary of the Army, among other senior presidential appointments in the Department of Defense. Sarah Minera, who was the staff lead for the Strategic Forces Subcommittee for the House Armed Services Committee, again, among other positions. And Bob Work, who is Distinguished Senior Fellow for Defense and National Security at CNAS, and of course, former Deputy Secretary of Defense, among the positions that he's had in and out of government. So with that, let me turn it over again to Shai, who's going to cover a few further logistics about how to play, introduce our adjudicator and strategist, and then we'll get moving with the game. Thanks, Shai.
Thanks so much, Richard. And thank you so much, Richard, who has been such a huge champion of doing all of this innovative gaming and live virtual events over the past year. It's pretty fun to have a boss who gets into it and lets you be really creative. So thank you, Richard. And before I get into the rules of the game and the premise, I actually want to give a shout out to this amazing crowd that is already lighting up the chat. We love seeing that. Elena says she's really excited to see the game. Jonathan, this is my favorite comment so far, says hopes this will be as awesome as the war game from last year, because that was one of the best things that he did over the pandemic. This year's strategy game, I promise, will be even better. We've got greetings from Taiwan. Lauren is thanking us for keeping us thanking us for keeping her on her toes, which we definitely will plan to do. And now I'll give a description of how we're going to do that. So the game today is focused on the Indo-Pacific region and looks specifically at the US-China competition. So your audience will weigh defense priorities and contend with limited resources to develop the next U.S. national defense strategy. Throughout the game, we will see how the resulting force fares against a dynamic China team and responds to unforeseen and possibly disruptive global events. So strategy is going to meet, reality multiple times. To aid in your decision, you will hear from our esteemed strategists, and they will present three distinct strategies. Becca Wasser will present the balanced approach throughout. The competition strategy will be presented by Stacey Pettyjohn. And the infinite offset will be presented by Chris Doherty. After they present, they will go up in front of our VIP NDS commission that Richard just introduced, and they will grill them and draw out the vulnerabilities and the trade-offs that are associated with each strategy. Once that happens, though, we will turn it over to you, the audience, to vote. And throughout today, there will be 3 moves. Each move will cover a period of 4 years. So from one NDS to the next NDS, that's National Defense Strategy, and then to a third one. And you'll vote on the strategy, and then you'll have a second vote that will be the strategy implementation. You'll be looking at a course of action to actually act and react to events that are happening in the world once you've chosen your strategy. So just to break it down, each move happens over 4 years. There's 3 moves. There's 2 votes in each move. So again, we're going to need a lot of interaction. And Fabiana, by the way, just wrote in the chat that just yelled because exclaimed Sarah Monero #fan. So Sarah, like me, there are other Sarah Monero fans participating in this event. The first move will take place in 2021. Then we will jump to 2025 after we do those first 2 votes during the first move. And then we will go to 2029. But because we have on hand master adjudicator, Ed McGrady, one might call him the John Madden of strategy games. Ed is going to also walk you through how the game is going to be adjudicated and how each move is going to work in more detail so you understand what rules you are playing with. Ed, take it away.
Well, thanks, Shai. As Shai said, you choose the blue strategy. You choose the strategy for the U.S. But strategies aren't built in a vacuum. Events might occur. The Congress will always be looking over your shoulder. And in addition, your competition, in this case, China, also gets a vote as to what they want to do. And they may not want your strategy to succeed. And so after you choose your strategy, as the U.S. We're going to transition to a phase where there's going to be an event. I'll announce some breaking news that may stress or test your chosen strategy, and then you get to vote again on how to respond to that particular event. You'll be given two choices, and you'll choose how you want to respond. And in addition to that, after that's done, we're going to have the competition come back as China and tell you what their strategy is. And so you'll vote on the U.S. strategy. You'll also vote on the response to an event, and then China will come in and tell you what their strategy is relative to the overall competition. And then I come in. Let's take a look at the map. As you can see on the map, there's three variables or three levers that we're going to be looking at as far as these strategies. One is capacity, which I interpret as the number of ships, aircraft, number of soldiers. It's how much stuff you have to do things with. And then there's capability, which is how that stuff does things. So you have technology, you have advanced AI, you have hypersonics, or maybe you keep conventional forces oops, I need to share my screen.
This is the fun of doing it live and unscripted, Ed, right? Because we're going to have these moments. It's nothing about this is easy, right?
I have a lot of technology on my side that I have to run at the same time.
You got to keep track of all of these factors. So I think we in the audience completely understand. But here we go. Look at this amazing map. I will disappear now.
Okay. As I said, capacity. We have these variables for both sides, the U.S. and China. We have capacity, we have capability, which represents your sort of technology level. And then we have readiness, which in addition to being able to operate all those ships and aircraft, represents your ability to project power, to operate out of area, operate in the first and second island chain as the US, or operate in the far ocean as China. And we've also divided the map up into different regions. As you'll see here, we have the first island chain, which is where China is challenging the U.S. for supremacy. And by challenging, what we mean is being able to influence our partners and allies, being able to conduct operations, essentially being able to assert yourself in that region. It's not like you occupy the region, but rather you can conduct operations and assert yourself. We also have the second island chain shown, and then we have two areas for the far ocean, both of which right now are controlled by the U.S. I just use contrasting colors to show the different areas. One is in Oceania, and the other reaches all the way from Africa over to the west coast of the U.S. Should you make decisions, I will be changing the various capacity, capability, and readiness values, which shows where you are in the competition. I will also be changing the colors on the map, which shows you where you are influencing and where you are dominating and where the adversary is potentially influencing and dominating. And those decisions will help inform your next choices. So what I will do is I will come back after the Chinese player has gone. I will come back and I will talk about what the story is so far, and then we will repeat the process again. So back over to you, Shai.
Thanks, Ed. And we will be seeing, I'm so fortunate we're going to be seeing a lot of you today, because at each interval, Ed's going to break down how the strategic environment has changed. So I'm already looking forward to Ed coming back. Now, we want to get everyone in the audience in the mindset for today's game. And in order to do that, we have a video that's going to tee up the strategic landscape. This is a fictitious video. This is for the purpose of the strategy game only. And it's there to help us, again, get in the mindset, set the mood. And with that, I'll look to our awesome production team behind the scenes. They're going to bring up the video in a moment. right. Welcome back. Just to briefly recap, China is the pacing challenge and top priority for the next National Defense Strategy, the 2021 National Defense Strategy. You will need to develop and implement a strategy that best meets the challenges posed by China's military maneuvers in the Indo-Pacific and the long-term technological threats posed by China's military modernization. When the game is over, everyone will break out of their roles and we'll have a post-game hot wash moderated by Stacy Pettyjohn, Senior Fellow and Director of the CNAS Defense Program. And as I've been doing so far, we will be calling out comments and taking questions as much as we can from the chat. So it's great to see everybody being so active there. And remember, if you're using Twitter, hashtag CNAS 2021 is where we'll be looking for your comments there. Okay. We've waited long enough. It is now time to begin move number 1. And I'm going to bring in Becca with the balanced approach. So again, to set the scene, Becca is now pitching her approach to the National Defense Strategy Commission. And Becca, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Shai. So as Shai mentioned, I'm Becca Wasser, and I am presenting a strategy today that you should choose to adopt for the next 4 years. As former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates once said, the Pentagon has a perfect track record when it comes to predicting wars. It has never once gotten it right. So given our role as a global leader, the United States cannot afford to have a defense strategy that only fixates on the long-term threat of conflict with China. Instead, the Pentagon should continue to do what it has always done: pursue a balanced approach that addresses a wide range of threats, theaters, and missions across timeframes. And the reasons for this, they're quite simple. While perhaps not as flashy as investing in artificial intelligence or robots, balanced flexibility is far less risky, and it has a proven track record of success. Adopting a massive shift in focus, it sounds great when you're just trying to craft a strategy, but it's incredibly difficult to implement. The past 2 administrations have found this out the hard way, when they've tried to say that they are going to pivot to Asia and instead found themselves being bogged down in the Middle East, and in the end, ending up having a pivot to nowhere. So in addition to that, there's also drastic changes in investment that are incredibly hard to actually implement because Congress holds the purse strings, and Congress is loath to cut programs or jobs that are within their districts. Balancing, however, it offsets all of these risks. But most importantly, balancing is the right thing to do. It allows the United States to remain a global leader. It allows us to shore up our alliances, use military power in support of diplomacy, and address the global and transnational threats of today and tomorrow. It enhances our preparedness for a wide range of potential events. It balances risk across time. Ultimately, we're not going to put all of our resources into future capabilities that might not come to fruition. We're also not going to double down on enhancing our readiness in order to respond to every single threat around the globe. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to invest in the right capabilities to improve our ability to compete. We are going to only respond with military means to the challenges that can't be solved with diplomacy. In doing all of this, we are going to prioritize. We're also going to make investments to counter some of the long-term transnational and global challenges that we face, whether this is climate change or biological threats like COVID-19. And so this approach that I'm advocating for, it's going to equally split resources among the departments of the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. We are going to retain balance among capability, capacity, and readiness across the spectrum of conflicts so that we can compete with, deter, and defeat challengers. We're going to make prudent investments in research and development without betting the farm on unproven technologies that might not work. And we're also going to focus on maintaining and modernizing the nuclear triad. But we're also going to plan to try and mitigate some of the impact of tomorrow's threats. We're going to place greater emphasis on managing the effects of climate change. We're going to reinforce some new missions for, alternate missions for the US military, whether this is long-standing missions like humanitarian aid and disaster relief, or trying to deal with, biological threats, as we saw with COVID-19. We're also going to work on enhancing US presence in forgotten regions like the Arctic, and we're also going to ensure that we're increasing our investments to make all of this happen. At the end of the day, a balanced approach strategy, it hedges against risk, and it enables us to compete and fight tonight and tomorrow. And that is why this is the strategy that you should choose. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Becca. Okay, we're going to bring up next Stacy Pettyjohn to deliver the case for the competition strategy.
Thanks, Shai. I'm here to tell you why you need to select the competition strategy. There's much wisdom in the saying that 80% of success in life is just showing up. The Pentagon is overly focused on a long-term military technical competition with China, while seemingly ignoring the fact that China is challenging the US-led international order each and every day under the threshold of military conflict. China is trying to extend its influence into the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, to the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, and along its border with India. If the United States does not respond to this incremental competition, it will wake up one day and find that the world is fundamentally changed. China will control the waters inside of the first island chain, having intimidated and dominated its neighbors without firing a shot. US failure to act could embolden Beijing to seize Taiwan or to declare a maritime exclusion zone in the South China Sea. In short, US military forces need to be there to prevent this aggression from occurring. Yes, this is a whole of government competition, but US military presence is the foundation that underpins the status quo and deters aggression. The Pentagon has been far too slow in responding to Chinese gray zone tactics, but if it begins to compete aggressively across the spectrum of conflict, it could still turn the tides in its favor. The Department of Defense must push its forces forward. US Navy ships must exercise freedom of navigation operations in disputed waters, while Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps aircraft must patrol the skies of our allied nations and continually operate in international airspace. Soldiers, Marines, and Special Operations Forces must help allies and partners to strengthen their ability to compete on their own. We must take steps to improve the defenses of our forces in response to China's growing offensive military capabilities so that they can provide a persistent presence to deter and assure. Yet this is a global competition, and the United States must fight to retain and expand its influence in key regions across the world. Trying to do more with less over the last decade has run our forces ragged and dug us into a readiness hole that we can't seem to get out of. The only way to solve this problem is building a larger force and investing more in near-term readiness at the cost of long-term modernization. Investing in technologies such as artificial intelligence and autonomous systems is risky. In the best case, these technologies will not be available for years. In the worst case, DoD sinks a ton of money into researching and developing these capabilities, and none of the technologies pans out. Remember the Army's future combat systems? If the US remains too focused on the future and doesn't bolster its capacity and readiness so that it can maintain a persistent military presence in contested areas, it may find that it loses the long-term competition in very short order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. All right, we will now bring up Chris Doherty to lead us through his pitch for the infinite offset. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Shai. Success in modern military competitions depends in large part on the ability of armed forces to develop innovative technologies and incorporate them into new ways of fighting. Historically, the United States has had a great deal of success with this, most notably during the military technical competition with the Soviet Union during the late Cold War. That advantage gave the United States an incredible ability to change the status quo, both globally, but particularly in Central Europe. And today, the United States is in a knockdown, drag-out military technical competition with China. Unlike the Soviet Union, however, China has the economic base to compete with us on a level playing field. And through its market power and its role in the global technology supply chain, it has an ability to rapidly acquire and integrate new and innovative technologies. If the United States doesn't address the growing imbalance in technology development, it could find itself on the wrong side of a military revolution driven by artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, and quantum computing. If that were to happen, the vast majority of US weapon systems would become obsolete relatively quickly. The United States would be unable to defend its allies and partners in East Asia. More worryingly, if China were to capitalize on its advantage in military technical competition to develop serious power projection capabilities, the United States could cease to be the dominant military power in the entire Indo-Pacific region and potentially even in the world. Now, it's not just this threat-based problem that drives the need for new technology. We also need it to offset rising personnel costs. If DoD is going to grow the long-term capacity of the force and to actually have the readiness to compete on a day-to-day basis in the future, it will need to do so without adding large numbers of increasingly expensive personnel. And the only way to do that is by developing new capabilities, leveraging autonomy and artificial intelligence. All is not lost in this competition, but time is growing quite short. DoD needs to move out quickly alongside industry partners to spur investments in critical new technologies while rapidly adopting innovation from the private sector. These changes need to be incorporated into a wholly new conception of the armed forces and military operations. This would be centered around large numbers of artificially intelligent and autonomous weapon systems capable of operating effectively in the most contested and degraded environments. Now, to achieve this goal, DoD is going to have to draw down its capacity and near-term readiness. It'll have to limit overseas operations for probably the next 5 to 10 years, particularly in the Middle East. These reductions in capacity and overseas operations spending will free up precious budget space to invest in the force of the future. Now, to hedge against possible Chinese aggression during this window, the strategy would protect modernization of the nuclear triad, increase our force posture in the Indo-Pacific region, and use special operations forces and other ground forces to work closely with allies and partners to help them build their own capacity to resist China. Back to you, Shai.
I'm muted. Thank you so much, Chris. Okay. Well, we've got some amazing comments in the chat. People cheering. Steven's cheering for Becca and Stacy. But really what we need to do right now is we need to convince the National Defense Strategy Commission. So let's bring up our commissioners and our commissioners, Bob, Eric, Sarah, and now let's bring up our strategists, and we're going to have our commissioners grill the strategists right now. And we're going to start with Sarah. Sarah, over to you. Fire away with some questions.
Yeah, thank you. Those were all really compelling strategies. I'm going to start with Becca on the balance strategy. A lot of this sounds like the status quo. A lot of it sounds like what we've been doing for the past, 10, 15 years. A lot of people tend to believe that that's pretty unsustainable. How are you defining victory? What are your strategic objectives here? What are the metrics by which you would say that this is a successful strategy for us to continue doing?
Thank you so much for that question, Sarah. That's a great one. And, it's something that I've heard a lot when we were initially developing this strategy. But ultimately, here is where we differ from the status quo. We differ in a few different ways. The first is we are taking not only a focus on today, but also a focus on tomorrow. We are thinking about the potential threats that we might face in the future and a longer term future. And part of this is trying to sort of broaden the definition of the challenges that we're going to face instead of retaining some of these traditional security constructs. Additionally, what makes us quite different in our approach is we are genuinely going to prioritize. I know it sounds like we're not prioritizing, but we truly are. We are making a choice that we need to be prepared for a wider range of threats that we are going to face both now and into the future. And if we over-optimize just for a single threat, because that seems like prioritization, we're going to find ourselves in a really bad position in the long term. So we're going to prioritize by ensuring that when we respond with military means, we are genuinely doing so because diplomacy has failed, or there aren't other tools of power, whether that's economic power, information space, that we could be leveraging. DoD doesn't need to be at the forefront of everything. Instead, what we can be doing is often being in support and often making the hard choices about when we prioritize. Thinking a little bit about your question of metrics, sometimes those are a little bit hard to actually, assess, in part because things like deterrence, you're trying to essentially assess the absence of something happening. But we're thinking a little bit about what it means to be a global leader, thinking about, measuring the success of our approach by, challenges that do not occur, being able to meet the challenges that do occur, but also, again, ensuring that we are a global leader and we are really reinforcing our role and our involvement with our allies and partners who we hope can step up and take some responsibility for their own security as well. So I know it seems like we are not any different than the status quo, but I can assure you that we truly are, because we have a future-focused approach and because we are making some of those hard choices, which allow us to make some of those trade-offs to have balanced capacity, capability, and readiness.
All right. Thank you, Becca. We're going to bring up our next commissioner, Eric. By all means, go ahead and grill the strategists. We just have to unmute you first.
Yep.
There we go.
Great presentations from everyone. I'm sure we all wish we could do all three of them, but of course we have constraints. So Stacy, let me turn to you on the competition strategy. China has a clear long-term strategy, in addition to what they're doing right now, that perhaps, as you suggest, we're not countering as well as we need to. But they're going to move ahead with their long-term strategy. So what happens to the United States in its relationship with China in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, based on your strategy?
Thanks, Eric. That is a very good question. And it is important to keep in mind that this is a long-term competition, that it's not going to be one today or tomorrow, and that we have to be in it for the long haul. But if we focus too far in the future, the problem is that we can potentially open up windows of vulnerability in the near term. And that's why we need to think about how we can compete today and keep moving towards the future. We can make a lot of improvements in terms of the survivability of our forces today and expand our presence to increase our lethality, which will help to shore up the balance in the near term. In the long term, we want to see what actually China does, what technologies it's able to field. Assuming that they're going to race ahead of us in some sort of arms race, I think is a questionable assumption. They've had trouble with a lot of different technologies. Aircraft engines in particular have been a problem for them. And I think that they will continue to have some of those challenges, just as we will. In terms of how we compete in the long term, we are going to rely on the strongest engine of innovation right now in the United States, which is in the private sector and in our universities. We're going to look to Silicon Valley and to commercial companies who are developing these new technologies that are often dual use. And once they make headway in terms of being able to improve them to the point that they're able to be used and put in the field with things like autonomous cars, then we will look to incorporate them into our military weapon systems.
Thank you, Stacy. All right, we're going to bring Bob up. And remember, audience, as soon as Bob is finished with his line of questioning, we are going to open the votes for you to pick the next national defense strategy. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to ask a clarifying question of the white cell, for lack of a better word. Do we have an assumption that all three of these strategies are being implemented on the same budget top line? Or are the three strategies coming in with different assumptions on top line?
All three strategies have the same budget.
And so we're starting at 715 billion in FY21, and we go from there. All right. Just a couple questions to each of the strategists, and I agree with Sarah and Eric. The presentations were great. For Becca, I perceived that it was less a description of what you would do in a balanced strategy and more of a defense why we shouldn't try to focus on the Chinese challenge, which we have been told is the #1 pacing threat and the broadest challenge over time. You mentioned it would be incredibly difficult to implement and incredibly hard to convince Congress that we would do so. But I was just thinking through my head and said, wow, if we had that type of thinking in the Cold War, we would have been crushed by the Soviet Union. So I would just like to know, why do you think it would be so difficult and hard to really say China is the pacing threat? Our strategy should focus on that threat, and here are the steps we would take to meet that challenge.
Well, thank you so much for that question, which is a good one. So a point of clarification, we are focusing on the China challenge, and we are trying to do more in the Indo-Pacific region. But what we are not doing is we are not over-optimizing for a single challenge that we are going to face. We believe that doing so is going to leave us underprepared for the future challenges that we faced, as well as, frankly, the challenges of today. We've already seen what's happened when we didn't focus on bio threats and disasters. DoD has had a huge role to play when it's come down to vaccine distribution during the pandemic. There's also been knocks to force readiness due to the pandemic. So we need to focus on challenges that are not just the traditional challenges and a traditional security threat, but instead broadening the space a little bit more. So we are focusing on China. We do recognize that both now China is a strategic competitor, and then in the long run, China could become, perhaps more of an adversary, if you will. And that China is embarking on a lot of different, policy initiatives, military modernization programs that we do need to address. But we're going to address these smartly. We're not going to only focus on that challenge, but a wider range, while still making sure that we are trying to keep pace to a certain extent with China's military modernization and address the threat, again, with military in support of diplomacy, as China is using multiple levers of power.
Thank you. Stacy, it would seem to me that the primary push on the competition strategy, as you said, is push forces forward in a very aggressive way and as many forces as we could put into the Indo-Pacific region, primarily to fight back against Chinese moves in the gray zone, etc. But it seems to me that you are a member of the present school, where present seems to have this mystical property. And I just wanted to know how much presence is enough. I mean, how many freedom of navigation exercises do you think would really convince China to stop whatever it is planning to do in the Pacific? Seems like a forlorn hope to me.
Thanks, Bob. I think going back to what you mentioned before, the Cold War, we saw that the value of a forward military presence was great, that we were able to have a solid, credible deterrent in not only Europe and on the Korean Peninsula, and that you need to have a forward combat capable presence. We need to be there for the day-to-day jousting that's occurring in the East and South China Seas. And it's not just all about freedom of navigation operations or FONOPs. It is our more day-to-day presence and exercising our right to sail through these waters and to show our allies and partners that we're there for them and that we have a lot of combat capability that is able to be incredibly responsive.
Thank you. And Chris, I think you know that I think your strategy is something that certainly talks to me. But as we have found out, it seems to me that it picks capacity and readiness have an enormous constituency in Congress, and presence has an enormous constituency in the combatant commanders. So all three, you pick a strategy in which all three of the constituencies are apt to fight against you. So how would you actually be able to implement this strategy? Have you thought about ways in which you would try to convince the constituencies that this actually is the best way to go?
I mean, I'm not going to presuppose to lecture you on how to do this, because you've actually been there and done that. But I do think there's a mixture of carrots and sticks in negotiations. So on the one hand, I think OSD has to run herd a little bit more, and be willing to say no to the combatant commanders, and particularly U.S. CENTCOM when they ask for additional forces to deal with whatever crisis of the moment requires shifting an aircraft carrier strike group from the Pacific to CENTCOM. We have to be more disciplined, and frankly, this is possible. I think we saw during the early period of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, then Secretary Mattis actually succeeded in withdrawing a significant quantity of forces from U.S. Central Command. It's just that over time, once he left and once his oversight left, those forces started creeping steadily back up. So it is possible. I think the congressional angle is a good point. I think one of the things we have to be willing to do is perhaps work one-for-one trades. It's clear that Congress lacks trust in the Department of Defense when we say we are going to divest to invest, if you will. They think that it's just divest and then the investments are never going to come. And so perhaps we need to go to more of a one-in, one-out model, where for every ship that we want to get rid of, or every aircraft squadron we want to get rid of, there is immediately on hand another squadron or ship to replace that. Again, probably not the most efficient way to go about doing modernization through things like block buys, et cetera. But nevertheless, it might be politically a more palatable option.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. All right, audience, the moment has come. You've heard our strategists defend their ideas before this distinguished panel. Go into the chat right now. And if you go into the chat, I know there's a lot of you there. You'll see in the bottom right, a little vote button appears. Click on the vote button and pick the approach that you think is most effective for this moment in time. Again, we're in 2021, and so pick your vote. I just voted, and in the meantime, while the votes are coming in, I'd love to ask, while we have this time, I'm going to ask panel members at different times, National Defense Strategy commissioners, some different questions. Sarah, you spent a lot of time working on the Hill, and Congress keeps coming up in all of these answers. Okay, how would you see the various strategies that have been talked about being received by the key members of Congress making decisions on these issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what's really important is to realize and recognize the fact that no party is a monolith, no chamber is a monolith. And, these members and these senators, as they look at these issues, they look at it through a lens not only of what's best for the country in their judgment, but also through their constituency. And so what it's important to do is to think about, in each one of these strategies, how does that impact their overall worldview of where the defense resources and investments should be relative to other discretionary budget kinds of priorities, but also to be able to really look through that through the lens of where their constituents are coming from, and being able to explain that in a coherent way back to people who don't live and breathe the really abstract, sometimes kind of second or third degree removed impacts of defense investment, of potentially, not investing as much in long-term modernization efforts, and what that looks like. And I think, quite frankly, every member of Congress that's up there is up there because, and sits on the committees of relevance, are there because they have a real, genuine desire to do what's best for the nation. And I think, you know, and it was mentioned in a couple of these discussions as well, I think that there needs to be more genuine coming together on the member level, on the committee level, on the oversight and the overseers as a co-equal branch of government, to be able to understand and demystify, quite frankly, a lot of this, you know, strategy talk into really people talk. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really all about. It's about protecting the nation, protecting the people, making sure that the investments that we make protect not only ourselves, but our future generations as well. And being able to frame decisions that can be very kind of abstract into those tangible ways, I think will go a long way with, quite frankly, almost all of the members of Congress.
Thank you, Sarah. As someone who is in the communications business, I really appreciate that point about how it has to, I think, make sense to the public, and our policy things, we could sometimes be in our bubble, but we need to ultimately have the American people on board. So thank you so much, Sarah. The good news here is we have our results in. A tough competition, but actually competition didn't win. The infinite offset won. 45% went to the infinite offset, 36% to competition, and 17% for balanced. So even though this strategy has been chosen, the events of the world are now going to set up your next decision for this move. Ed McGrady is going to come in now and tell the audience, all right, reality is now hitting the strategy. What's happening?
Well, I told you that the Congress might be looking over your shoulders in this game, and it is in this case. Congress has decided to refuse to allow the Pentagon to make some of the force size cuts and other cuts of older weapon systems that might be needed to fund some of these capabilities that are coming in the future. And so let's go to Stacy and Chris to talk about what your options are and how to react to it.
Thanks, Ed. So Congress has wisely seen the risks associated with the infinite offset strategy. Chris's strategy is presenting technology like it's an easy button and that it's going to solve all of our problems. And they realize that if we focus too much on the far future, that we're going to neglect today, and that we really need to be prepared to compete and deter today. So my course of action, the one that I would propose that you vote for, is course of action A, where you forego this divest to invest strategy and you accept the fact that you need to maintain enough capacity and readiness to compete today, and you scale back your modernization. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Stacy. Obviously, this isn't what we wanted, and although it's not a totally unforeseen event, Congress does have the power of the purse strings, and they get to control appropriations. And so I think it's incumbent upon the department to go down and go to the Hill, do a full court press, and really get the Secretary of Defense and other senior military leaders to engage with members and their staffs and explain why investing in the future is so critical for U.S. national security. And ultimately, Stacy says all these technologies are unproven, but what we can prove is that our current force is aging out. Much of the current DoD force structure, and in particular our ships and aircraft, have never been older in the history of the United States Armed Forces. And the average age of the average tactical aircraft is older than many of the panelists here. In which case, that not to say that we're all that those of us who are talking to you are ancient, but that's a very old life frame for an aircraft or a ship. And so we need to modernize quickly. And the only way to do that is to invest in the capabilities and the technologies that will bring on this next generation of platforms and weapon systems. And we have to just, as Sarah was saying during her discussion, we have to make it clear why this is so important to U.S. national security. Back to you, Shai.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, audience, your next vote is up. You choose between the two options here. We're just going to flash them on the screen again. on our slide in case you need a recap of either Stacy's, that's option A, or Chris's, that is option B. I'm going to bring that slide up right now. Here we go. So there's your slide. If you need a recap here, those are your options in A or B. And while you are voting, we're going to again turn to our panel. I'd love to bring Eric up here. Eric, hopefully there's Eric, how are you?
Great, thank you.
Okay, you've served in, or you've worked in, I don't want to misrepresent, but you have worked in Army, Navy, Air Force. You've had roles in all of those. It seems like we're hearing a lot of ships, aircraft, technology, whereas, when people think of the Army, they think of like people forces. What do you think the Army would see in the various strategies that are being proposed, in particular the one that was chosen, the infinite offset?
Well, I think obviously in an infinite offset strategy, the Army sees itself as a bill payer, which is what they're kind of struggling with right now. They even talk about it quite openly, that moving towards a China-centric strategy, whether it's near term or far term, whether it's presence or next generation technology, comes at the expense of force structure in the Army. You'll see the Army try to figure out how it can be a part of that fight, but I think recognizing that if that's the strategy, it's air and maritime.
All right,
space and cyber as well. That haven't come up yet.
All right. Thank you so much. While we wait for our results. Oh, we've got our results in. Okay. Looks like 78% have gone with COA B, with course of action B, have gone with the action proposed by Chris. And again, these things don't happen in a vacuum. We're getting a report in that the team in Beijing, led by our China expert Jacob Stokes, will be playing the part of Beijing today, is going to update us on what the competitor on this game board is planning to do in response to these moves that you all, the audience, have made. Jake, take it away.
Thanks, Shai. Hello from Beijing. My role in this game will be to share with you a candid explanation of China's national defense strategy, which takes into account the regional and global security situation, current events, and also responds to threats from other major powers, namely the United States. Given those conditions, our strategy can be summarized as active defense and asymmetric aggression. This strategy reaffirms our existing focus on winning informationalized local wars. Our priority here is securing China's core interests in East Asia and preventing U.S. intervention in Chinese affairs, especially those concerning Taiwan and other territorial claims. The strategy has two pillars. First, the active defense pillar of our strategy expands the size and sophistication of the People's Liberation Army's arsenal that's designed to counter U.S. intervention. To that end, it would build more missiles, more long-range bomber and fighter aircraft that we can operate from the mainland, and more submarines to target U.S. military assets throughout the region. Those same capabilities would help us control critical choke points in the First Island chain. Further, our strategy would increase investments in space, cyber, and electromagnetic warfare capabilities to attain information superiority early in a conflict. We believe these areas represent the commanding heights of warfare. Second, the asymmetric aggression, or gray zone pillar of our strategy. Here we would grow the China Coast Guard and what Western strategists have called our maritime militia. These quasi-military forces can flood areas within the East and South China Seas to harass vessels and oil platforms and otherwise block freedom of navigation for U.S. allies and partners. These activities are central to our efforts to expand and consolidate our political, economic, and territorial control throughout East Asia, without always resorting to overt aggression using formal military forces. We would seamlessly integrate the two military pillars with our other tools of national power, including economic coercion and political, informational, and legal campaigns. These would help us achieve our geopolitical objective of creating a new China-centric order in the region. Ultimately, we see this as a near-term project. We will continue to accumulate gains one piece at a time and pick apart U.S. alliances while the United States prepares for a high-end fight a decade or more in the future. In other words, we'll win the game in part by changing the board on which it's played. In terms of geography, this strategy focuses on regional operations in East Asia and to a lesser extent, our western border with India. But it would still invest in limited power projection capabilities such as amphibious vessels, a limited number of aircraft carriers, and heavy lift transport aircraft. The aim, though, would be to advance our territorial and other interests locally rather than attempting to seriously challenge the US military posture across the entire Indo-Pacific, much less the world. Our power projection capabilities would be tailored for evacuating our citizens and protecting our commercial interests overseas. Finally, we would retain modest investments in developing and deploying next-generation technologies, preparing for what we call the intelligentization of warfare. But those investments would be secondary to those I've outlined above. So that's an overview of the strategy. To help demonstrate what it would mean and what it would look like in practice, I will share with you one action we'll take right now to implement it. And that is we've developed and tested hypersonic missiles capable of striking ground and maritime targets at a range of 1,500 nautical miles. This would increase risks for U.S. forces operating from or near Guam and the Marianas Islands during a conflict. So that's the strategy from Beijing. Back to you, Shai.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, now the strategic environment has changed. We're moving 4 years into the future. It's now 2025, or it's almost 2025. And in order to set the stage for that, Ed McGrady is going to come up. And Ed, tell us how the strategic environment has changed in the wake of these developments.
Well, let's take a look at the map, Shai. As you can see on the map, I'll wait for it to come up. As you can see on the map, the U.S. you as the U.S. chose to build up your capability, which is not an unreasonable choice, given the fact that you don't want to be following China in terms of capability.
Hey, Ed, you might have to reload the screen share of that map. Again, everyone, this is unscripted. So we're changing the map and the game board in real time. So when the map comes back up, we'll
doing that now.
All right. We will continue giving everyone the breakdown. While we're doing that, though, we've had some awesome comments from the audience that I'll read. Connell Jarvis, he's been active, by the way, all week. Connell, he was pushing for move B, but Ben Black went A, no brainer. So it's great to see people mixing it up. And now that our map is back, I'd love to hear everyone mix it up on what they think about the results.
Okay, like I said, you doubled down on technology, apparently not screen share technology, but you doubled down on technology and increased your capability. And even though the Congress attempted to thwart that noble goal, you managed to stave them off, except that they put a freeze on your you're taking the cuts and taking the pay for it offsets in the places where you wanted. So you had to take those offsets from somewhere to increase your capability, and those offsets came out of readiness. Meanwhile, China really doubled down on an asymmetric local strategy within the first island chain, where it pushed its assets and built its assets in such a way that would dominate in the first island chain. And that's pretty much what it's done. China now more or less dominates in the first island chain. That does not mean it owns everything in the first island chain, but rather it has a lot of influence, and it's putting a lot of pressure on partners and allies in that region, which means that the U.S. Is not as frequently in there. You're not doing as many exercises with your friends, and that you're feeling a lot of pressure in that first island chain. However, because you maintained a lot of your capacity, the second island chain and the far ocean areas are still areas of competition with China, and that will tee up the next round, where China has more or less stayed the same. The U.S. is pulling ahead in capability. So if that fight between the U.S. and China actually has to happen, the U.S. will have some advantage in terms of its ability to target and destroy Chinese assets. But at the same time, China's capability is allowing it to push off and begin to dominate the first island chain. So what do you want to do about that in the next turn? Do you want to double down on capability? Do you want to go back in and try to reassert U.S. prominence in the first island chain and keep the second island chain? Those decisions are up to you. Back over to you, Shai.
Thank you so much. All right, it is time now for. Thank you so much, Ed. That was great. It's time now to bring up our strategists. We're going to bring them up in order of which your votes came in the previous round. So first up, we're going to hear from Chris in the Infinite Offset. And I know our commissioners are going to be standing by. You know, now that you're in that front position, I imagine you're going to get quite a grilling this time around.
So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for making the right choice vis-a-vis the strategy and voting for Infinite Offset. And then again, maintaining strategic discipline when Congress threw a wrench in the plans. It's extremely difficult both to formulate a future-looking strategy, but perhaps it's far more difficult to actually implement it. So kudos to everybody in the audience for maintaining that level of strategic discipline. And now is no time to divert from that strategy. As Ed pointed out, the map hasn't really changed yet. And part of that's because our investments haven't really come to fruition. And as Ed rightly pointed out, it takes a while to draw down capacity. So the first thing you're going to see the hit to is readiness. But in the next turn, we're going to start to see some of the capabilities that we've been developing trickle into the force. You're going to start to see that capability lever, that capability metric start to move into U.S. advantage. And what you're going to see when that happens is that the shade of the military balance, what we're trying to improve here, vis-a-vis China and the second and first island chains, is going to start shifting back toward U.S. advantage. And I think you see this reflected in Red's chosen strategy. China looked at what we were doing and decided, well, I don't think we can do an AI arms race with the United States. And B, it's not the time for us to go out and project power into the Indian Ocean. We have to make sure that our near seas, our territory, is defended against the potential of these new U.S. weapon systems. And if you ask me as a U.S. strategist, that is a win. A world in which China is focused on defending its own terrain and its own near shores is a world in which the rest of the world is relatively freer from Chinese intervention. Now, it's possible that they'll use things like, maritime militia and various commercial ships to harass and disrupt and impose what, some might call these gray zone operations on us. But what we're developing is the additional capabilities necessary to counter those in the future, right? We can't just keep doing it with aging ships and aging aircraft that are going to spend increasingly more time in their hangars and in their dry docks. So the key thing here is staying focused and staying disciplined. Back to you, Shai.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We are now going to go to Stacy. Stacy, make your case for competition. You were close last time. Let's see if you can compete well enough.
Well, thanks, Shai. Everything that I warned you about is starting to actually bear out. We now have a hollow force. It's not ready. It can't actually be forward to deter and to compete. And staying the course and holding on to or clinging to a failing strategy is a bad idea. China now dominates its near waters within the first island chain. And there's nothing to stop it from deciding that today is the day that it decides to seize Taiwan or seize one of the other features in the South China Sea. We are unable to contest or stop it because we have reduced our readiness and are trying to retire the capabilities that we have on hand. Yes, some of our ships and aircraft are old, but we could buy new ones of the same types and refurbish the existing ones that we have so that they have a longer lifespan. And we could be out there competing. The future is today. There's nothing to stop us from losing right now should China decide and realize that this window of opportunity that we've given it is closing.
Thank you, Stacy, for that impassioned argument for competition. Let's bring up Becca as she tries to bring balance to the force here. Becca, over to you.
Okay, so let me explain to you why my approach is the best approach in order to counter China's strategy. First and foremost, we have relationships with a variety of different countries within the first and second island chains, and we are all about relationships. So we are going to ensure that we are, fulfilling our end of the bargain of that relationship, which is enhancing some of those countries' security. So we are going to double down on helping them build up some of their capabilities. We're also going to be working with some of our other allies and partners around the globe to enhance burden sharing so we can counter some of that China challenge. At the end of the day, China seems to be having adopted an approach that's kind of multi-pronged. It's undertaking some of these more asymmetric gray zone tactics. And a lot of these tactics are not just military focused in nature. They do involve, political, economic, and information activities. And frankly, a balanced approach is the only strategy of the three that really represents a whole of government approach, because we are military power in support of diplomacy and other tools that America has in its toolkit. Additionally, we are doing something that the competition strategy is not doing, which is prioritizing when we are going to choose to respond to any of China's gray zone tactics. If we try and push our forces forward and constantly respond to every single little thing that China does, at the end of the day, that ends up being a cost-imposing strategy on us. How on earth are we going to rebuild readiness if we are constantly having to be in a responsive posture even? So we are not going to do that. We are going to prioritize when we decide to respond to some of the most egregious examples of Chinese gray zone tactics, and we're going to try and rebuild readiness that way. Additionally, we're still making some of these advancements and capabilities that we need in order to counter some of China's long-term modernization. One of the areas in which a balanced approach is investing in, it's long-range precision fires. And so by having these fires, it allows us to posture our forces outside of some of the worst threat rings that China has, and allows us to enhance the survivability of our forces, because that's deeply important to us. So with all of this in mind, you should do the right thing, and it's time to shift to a more balanced approach to better counter China's strategy, but also to enhance our ability to compete, deter, and defeat in the long term.
Thank you so much, Becca. Well, the audience is just lighting up the chat. We have so many great comments. BB says Stacy is 100, but let's see what the National Defense Strategy Commission has to say. Let's bring them up, and let's bring up our strategists. And Sarah, we're going to turn to you first. Take it away with your questions for the strategists.
Yeah, this one's for Stacy. When you start to increase your force presence in the region, one of the risks that you end up posing is strategic miscalculation and escalation control, because the force presence itself, right, may be misinterpreted. How are you, in the context of this strategy, able to address those very real concerns?
Thanks, Sarah. Escalation control and escalation management is clearly an important issue and something that this strategy has thought a lot about. Deterrence, in essence, is a threat, however, and you have to be able to run some level of risk to actually effectively deter an opponent. The way that we would manage escalation risk with the competition strategy is by being very clear about our intent, which is to uphold the status quo, to ensure that no aggression is permitted, and to protect our allies and partners in the region and the freedom of the commons. We will make that abundantly clear to China and everyone else, and then also make clear that we are going to demonstrate and uphold our commitment to these goals by being there and by exercising and operating our military forces in a way that's responsible, that is in accordance with international norms and responsible behavior. And should China decide to behave in a more reckless or aggressive fashion, we're going to be sure to capture evidence of this and to share it with the international community to make it clear to them who is actually transgressing in this situation.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, Stacy. All right, Eric, bring you up to the main chair.
Great, thanks. I'm going to target this to Chris. He's in the hot seat. It's a two-part question, Chris. First, you said we need to suppress the COCOM appetite, and I'm curious where you think would be the first choice places to go to take risk in forward deployed activity and or basing. And then the second part is near-term readiness as a risk decision in your strategy. We've seen this before. The readiness thing can hollow out rather quickly, and it becomes a very hard thing to recapture, particularly because Congress is inclined towards people and things, and readiness is hard to explain or show when you have a problem. So what is your near-term strategy to get at the readiness that you're taking near-term risk on?
So in terms of the COCOM demand signal, I mean, the easy answer is always, well, let's look at Southcom and AFRICOM. But in reality, right, there's just not much there. There is some force structure there. There's some force utilization there. But really, the primary driver of this is U.S. Central Command and ongoing operations there, which continue to deplete the readiness and deplete the availability of our air and naval, and in some cases, ground and special operations forces for other challenges elsewhere. That is sort of the big bill payer here. And your point about readiness is perfectly correct. I do think that there is a risk of that, but I think if you're going to make a sort of revolutionary transformational change in the force, we might also have to rethink how we think about readiness. And I think a brief period in which we take some risk in near-term operations, provided that we maintain at least a core that is still ready and capable of competing with China in the near term, but also deterring any aggression in the Indo-Pacific, should be able to make this transition from sort of the extant force that we have today toward the more AI autonomy-enabled offset force of the future without undue risk of aggression in the near term.
Thanks. Do I have time for one more? I have one for Stacy.
Go for it.
Stacy, the Biden administration wants to emphasize and lead with diplomacy. Doesn't your strategy undercut that and militarize our foreign policy?
Thanks, Eric. No, not at all. We understand that the military is the backstop and sort of the foundation of deterrence, but we're focused on the military threats, not the broader competition that occurs in the economic and political and diplomatic spheres. That is somebody else's business within the interagency. We are focused on preventing territorial aggression and changes to the status quo international order. We will consider things like cyber threats and information threats that target the U.S. military or our allied militaries, but we're not broadly looking to combat disinformation in general or to prevent there from being hacks against commercial infrastructure and things like that. That is someone else's responsibility to protect those areas.
Great, thank you.
All right, bringing up Bob Work. Bob, very interested. You were one of the implementers of the third offset. I'm dying to hear your questions. I'm sort of teeing up and hoping you've got some for Chris here.
No, actually, I have one question for all three of our strategists. So
That's great too.
In 2025, the U.S. is starting to pull ahead in capability, which is very good to hear. China is dominating the first island chain. Readiness is starting to go in a unfavorable direction. So I wanted to ask all three of the strategists, how would your strategy specifically approach our allies, given the conditions that have been laid out in 2025?
I think I'll go first because that'll give the other folks a chance to catch up and respond to my reply. I think my view is that you have to work very hard on using diplomacy and other tools to help reassure our allies during a period in which they might perceive our commitment to be somewhat lower. One of the things we often dealt with with strategy over the last 5 to 10 years is the growing gap between what's necessary for deterrence and what's necessary for ally reassurance. And those two things are not always as contiguous as we might like them to be. What we're trying to build toward is a force that's capable of deterring. And what we need to demonstrate to our allies and partners, whether this is through diplomacy or through combined exercises, is the reassurance aspect of that strategy. And again, this might not be a one-size-fits-all approach. There might be some allies, such as Japan and Australia, and some partners, such as Taiwan, upon which we focus a great deal of attention in terms of reassurance. There might be other areas, however, such as Central Command, where we spend relatively less effort on reassuring allies and partners and encourage them to take up their own defense.
I would just say that we're in an unfavorable position right now, thanks to the strategy that we've chosen. I would imagine a lot of our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific are wondering whether they can count on us and whether they are going to fall victim to Chinese aggression while we are building up our new and improved force of robots that are assisted by AI. And that there's nothing that we can do to help them in the near term. So the competition strategy would seek to rectify this reassurance and deterrence gap by reaching out to our closest allies in the Indo-Pacific and emphasizing that we still have forces and bases there, some of them, and that we're going to rebuild readiness in the force in the near term and make improvements by increasing the capacity of spare parts and putting more resources towards maintenance and also more resources towards training so that we can be there for them soon. We're not going to wait for 5-10 years when we can field enough of these new forces to help them out, that we will find a way to be there today and every day, because we are also a Pacific nation. Guam, which now is under threat of Chinese hypersonic missiles, is a US territory. So this is incredibly important to the United States. We are a part of the Indo-Pacific region and we are going to remain one. Over to you, Becca.
So I'm not going to belabor all of the points that my fellow strategists just made. There are elements in which I agree with Stacy. There are a lot of elements where I actually end up agreeing with Chris for once in my life. But at the end of the day, if you're looking for a strategy that is focused on allies and partners, well, it's a balanced approach. We are all about allies and partners. Part of this is ensuring that they understand our commitment to their security to the extent to which we've made security commitments in the near term. And again, we are going to be using some other elements of power, diplomacy for one, to ensure the reassurance part of the equation. We instead are going to double down on the deterrence part of the equation, but not in sort of the everyday sense that Stacy has been advocating for. Instead, we're going to really be working on enhancing the capabilities of our partners to take responsibility for their own security. Because in the long run, really what we're trying to shift toward is to burden share, so that at the end of the day, the United States is not responsible for having to respond to every single thing that happens. We're going to try and lower our operational tempo in part so we can rebuild readiness. But at the heart of our strategy is really just working with allies and partners and working as a key part of the global commons.
Thank you so much, Becca. Thank you to our National Defense Strategy Commission and to our strategist. Voting is now open, audience. Are you going to go with the infinite offset? You're going to stick with that? Are you going to go with the competition strategy, or are you going to go with the balanced approach? The audience is also weighing in on the chat, so I'm going to read a couple of these before asking our commissioners some questions here. Fabiana writes, I want to vote for Stacey Pettyjohn, but as a political scientist, the idea of the Secretary of Defense trying to convince Congress to do something just sounds more fun. and then uses our hashtag. By the way, our hashtag is CNAS 2021. I also saw another great comment, or I would say fun comment is the better way to describe it. And this I would love to direct to our commissioners. David notes in the chat, poor CENTCOM being treated not as well as it used to, says it's going from the penthouse to the outhouse. I see some smiles there. Bob, why don't you start there? You as a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, you're balancing all of these different things at the same time. Would love to know your thoughts on where CENTCOM would be playing out in this 2025 situation.
Well, I don't think a lot of people understand that starting in around 2014, we started an operation called Spartan Shield, and it was starting to flow forces into the region to deter Iran. There's about 50 or 60,000 U.S. forces in the region right now. And, bringing in a second carrier strike group is supposedly to help deter Iran. But none of these conventional forces deter Iran from doing what it does, which is operating at a subconventional level. Iran isn't thinking about launching an invasion of Iraq or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. They're trying to pursue their goals over time. So I think it is reasonable to say that we can draw down the conventional forces in the Middle East, perhaps increase our special operations forces modestly, do what Becca recommends, and really work on our partners and allies to build up their capabilities to fight against Iranian malign influence. But there's a lot of way to go, in my view, to bring down forces in the Middle East before CENTCOM has any true reason to complain. If you ask for a second carrier strike group for a 6-month rotation to go into the Gulf, that costs about $1 billion. When you're in a flat or declining budget, that means that $1 billion is competing. Now that we've gotten rid of OCO, so everything is in the base budget, that $1 billion competes against every other program element or readiness, O&M, or whatever it is. And you have to really start asking yourself, what is the opportunity cost in the program for that single carrier to plow holes in the ocean for 6 months? And under those conditions, CENTCOM should lose, in my view, because our priority is in the Pacific. And you can see how this competition is playing out over time. This is a tough competition. And, you have to be able to really prioritize what you want to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. And I think it's really interesting also to talk about also the goals, right? What are we trying to achieve? What is the competitor or the adversary trying to do there? And what are the right forces and the right structures to address those? So thank you so much for that. And with that, our results are in from the first vote of Move 2, and it was so close. Competition and balanced were going neck and neck, but competition came in with 40% of the vote, balanced at 37. And oh, how the mighty have fallen. Infinite Offset is now at 21% with the audience. So once again, strategy has to meet reality. And in that case, it means it's going to meet Mr. Ed McGrady. Our master adjudicator is going to come up and tell the audience what they will now have to react to as they implement the strategy. Ed, come on up.
Well, I had told you that the first island chain was being dominated by China, but you decided to push in anyway. And in doing that, you had a freedom of navigation operation go awry. U.S. warship hit a Chinese Coast Guard ship. Shots were exchanged, and it was a fairly large mess. So you have some decisions to make. Even though there were no casualties, you still have some decisions to make. So let's go to Stacy and then Chris to decide what some of your options are to deal with this situation.
Thanks, Ed. This unfortunate accident just shows you how hard it is to get back in and how nature abhors a vacuum. China quickly filled in the space when the United States minimized its presence in the region in order to focus on modernization. And now we have to reassert ourselves and reestablish these norms to ensure that China does not try to de facto control its near waters. This was an unfortunate incident. You can see how China is trying to stay below the threshold of war using a Coast Guard vessel instead of the PLA Navy. But this is exactly why we need to be there. We need to actually expand our presence forward, accompany it by a clear declaratory policy, provide evidence to the international community of China's culpability for this incident and for any future transgressions or accidents that could occur, and take steps to increase the training of our own force so that they are prepared to and avoid any sort of accidents should China behave irresponsibly again. So please stay the course now. We're making gains. This is the sign of how difficult it would be if we pulled back now. It will get even harder. So please vote for course of action A. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk about the alternative.
So, we've decided to bring a lot of knives to a really, really dangerous gunfight, and not surprisingly, things didn't go well for us. With that being said, we've got to figure out what do we do now, and I would advocate strongly for reducing the U.S. forward presence inside the first island chain to prevent another such accident, particularly because we've failed to invest in the requisite capabilities to actually be able to go toe-to-toe with ships like the Type 55 advanced PLAN destroyer, which is leaps and bounds more advanced than many of our aging ships. So if this were to have escalated and this wasn't just a minor scrape with a China Coast Guard vessel, but was instead a scrape with a significantly advanced PLA Navy ship, this could have gone quite poorly. So I think it's time to pull back a little bit, to press reset on this strategy, and think about how we can rebuild the readiness, rebuild the capability of the force, so that we can actually move back into the first island chain in strength. Back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, audience, your next vote is open. A will go with Stacy's option. B will go with Chris's option. You can see those on the slide right now. Just go to the bottom of your chat, and I know lots of folks have been active, which is terrific. Also, we continue to get great comments from everyone in the audience, making cases for the different options. Steven says, I think I'd prefer balanced here. Surely the short-term impacts due to the infinite offset approach were foreseen, so I don't think we should go back on that now. But I do think it would be good not to let the immediate situation with China get out of control. And Connell says, if we have to do both, I think balanced should be the strategy now, with a regression to infinite offset. And some other votes we've got in there. Connell comes back and is voting for B, saying it makes no sense to increase our exposure and vulnerability with the strongest area of Chinese influence and material. We risk a full-scale war, which helps no one. So very, very active chat. Keep the comments coming while we're waiting for the votes to come in. I believe our Beijing team is ready to respond to the U.S. strategy. All right, we're bringing up Jake Stokes, representing Beijing in this game. Jake, tell us how Beijing is responding.
Well, thanks, Shai, and welcome back to Beijing, everybody. Given the regional and global security conditions, it's time for us to shift our strategy. Our new approach can be summarized as technological leapfrog. We plan to offset the offset, if you will. Based on the current military balance of power and projected trends in U.S. investments, we now believe that we have sufficient capabilities to counter major intervention in East Asia, despite the competition approach. So it's time for us to leap ahead. Our new strategy is now aiming to supplant the United States as the world's dominant military power by investing heavily in cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomy, and quantum computing. This approach will fully leverage our military civil fusion program, which integrates innovation between the two sectors to maximize both military power and economic heft. It would also leverage the fact that the US, which is now pouring money into readiness on behalf of a competition strategy, is not really procuring and fielding or ready to have that those infinite offset capabilities further down the line. So we want to have them instead. So in the near term, our strategy will continue to, or will sustain our focus on regional defense and asymmetric coercion, especially now because of our early moves. We've achieved a pretty commanding position in the first island chain, but it would slow the growth of the overall size of the People's Liberation Army in order to accelerate development and deployment of what we call intelligentized weapon systems over the long term, as well as training the highly skilled service members needed to operate them. Now, what I mean by intelligentized is really about an advanced stage of joint operations across all domains that's enabled by AI and autonomy. It's really about gaining a decisive advantage at the very highest end of a military contest. So again, deployed at scale, these disruptive technologies will really usher in a new revolution in military affairs. And now we think we can get there before the United States gets there, given the shift in strategy. So just as the Soviet Union or the United States surpassed the Soviet Union in military power by ushering in an information revolution in warfare, we and China will now surpass the United States by ushering in an intelligentized revolution in warfare. And although it'll take some time to bear fruit, this exponential shift in technical prowess will enable China to deploy large numbers of intelligent and autonomous power projection forces. We'll start doing that in the first island chain when we can, and then move out through the Indo-Pacific and eventually beyond. And it's important to note for us that this type of leapfrog strategy really represents a more technologically ambitious force than we've really called for to date. Instead of the PLA becoming basically modernized, which is our standard for reaching by the year 2035 and eventually world-class by 2049, we would aim to define the military technological cutting edge in the coming decades, at least for the most modernized portions of our forces. So in short, our modernization will really leapfrog forward to build the best 21st century military, rather than doing what the US is doing now, which is doubling down on operating and continue to buy capabilities from the 20th century. So for the same reasons the US did it in the first turn, we now think we're in a strong position to seize the future and to get there first. And to help, so that's an overview of the strategy. To help show a little bit about what the strategy would look like in practical terms, I can share with you now another action we've taken to implement it. And that is we've demonstrated an AI system capable of defeating human opponents in highly complex war games. So we're making real progress. So that's it from Beijing. Back to you, Shai. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake, playing for Team Beijing. Now the strategic environment has changed once again, and Master Adjudicator teeing up move 3. We will bring back our Master Adjudicator, Ed McGrady, to show us the map and show us how things have changed. Thank you so much, everybody who has been voting throughout. Remember, after this next move, we are still going to keep the conversation going with a post-game show, and you should stay on and stay in the chat and keep your comments going. Ed, how has the world changed?
Well, let's take a look at the map, and I can show you how the world's changed. The U.S. has made some bold and decisive maneuvers. First of all, it decided to push into the first and second island chain to double down on its capacity and its ability to counter China and reinforce our relationship with our friends and allies. And for that reason, both the first island chain and the second island chain have changed in colors. The first island chain, China still has a lot of ability to operate, but we're operating in there, as we saw with that freedom of navigation event. And the second island chain, we're beginning to push in and take control of it and dominate in the second island chain and really reinforce the partnerships that we built there. And of course, the far oceans remain the same. And the reason we can do that is we have both capability, which you built on the first move, and now you've built some capacity. As I said, I would evaluate capacity on the second move. And by pushing in and making Congress happy, essentially, you've doubled down on some of the weapon systems, doubled down on some of the platforms, and you've managed to increase your capacity in order to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. In addition, the event, which was that freedom of navigation collision, which may have actually been caused by the fact your readiness is still down, didn't deter you from continuing to push in. So you were consistent with your strategy. When something came up that was a speed bump, you just rolled over it and moved on. And that helped you with respect to maintaining that presence in the second and first island chains. China, meanwhile, saw that it was a follower in technology, and so it invested in its capability this turn to try to catch up, which now China is moving towards parity in terms of capability with the US, but the US has moved a little bit ahead in terms of the number of platforms that it potentially has. Of course, as has been noted in the chat, and I am monitoring the chat, the risk has increased in this situation. You are now pushing in to areas that China wants to dominate. Your forces are interacting, as we saw with the Freedom of Navigation Act, and the overall risk of a collision between the US and China has increased in this situation. So you're taking some risk, but at the same time, you're pushing back against what China is doing. Do you want to continue to push back, or do you want to continue to modernize, or do you want to do something else? The choice is really yours on the next turn. Shai?
Hey, Ed, we have a couple of questions in the chat just specifically asking you to highlight where those changes are happening in the map. The changes, folks, are happening principally in the sliders, but I was wondering if we could bring it up quickly just so you could highlight that a little bit more for the audience, because there were a couple of questions.
Sure. I'll go through all the changes on the map. If you can't see my cursor, that's the problem. The first island chain turned from a different shade of red to a slightly lighter shade of red. And the second island chain turned blue to a light shade of blue, which means the U.S. is still challenged in that area, but has the dominant hand right now. The far ocean areas, the two far ocean areas did not change. The capability for China went up, and the capacity for the U.S. went up. None of the other sliders changed other than those two. So hopefully that helps orient you as to what changed.
Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you for all the work you're doing behind the scenes, putting together the master equation to evaluate these answers. So with that, it's time for our strategist. This is the last move. The move, again, has 2 votes. We're now in the year 2029, and we're going to start with the winner, or the strategy that prevailed in the last round. So the competition strategy led by Stacy. Stacy, come on up and make your case to our National Defense Strategy Commission.
Thanks, Shai. As Ed just explained, you can see we're making gains. And despite what we heard from Beijing, don't panic. There is no technological easy button here. And they have a lot of progress that needs to be made to make significant gains in this area. The United States still has unparalleled private sector and universities that are working on these different technologies and that will help us in the long run. But it's not clear that autonomy and AI are really going to yield a revolution in military affairs in the way that some people expect. And just because a computer was able to defeat a person in a war game does not signify the end of the world, and that AI can actually make decisions in the real world environment, which is incredibly complicated. Even the most complex war game is still a closed system that is so much easier to figure out than the real world, which human beings have to perceive and act in. So stay the course. We're making gains. We're rectifying things in the near term. It's not clear at all that China is going to actually jump ahead of us. Thanks, Shai.
Thank you so much. Okay, Becca, with the balance strategy, was so close in the last round. Can you close the gap this time? That's the big question with our incredible audience.
Well, that's the aim here, especially because we've tried both of the other strategies and they have seemingly failed quite dismally. So Looking at Stacey's competition strategy and the current strategic environment, we're at a place in which readiness has been degraded significantly, and we need to rebuild it. We're not going to continue to rebuild it under the competition approach, where we're pushing forces forward all the time and responding to every single thing that China does. Instead, we need to focus on rebuilding our readiness, and that is something that does not happen overnight, unfortunately. So adopting a longer term view, adopting a balanced approach means that we are going to continue to push forward with enhancing some of the capabilities of our allies and partners with an aim toward burden sharing in order to reduce our operational tempo. Additionally, we've seen that China is really focused on making a bunch of capability enhancements, and it's demonstrated some of its capabilities already. Particularly as the competition strategy has pushed our forces forward, putting them at additional risk from Chinese attack, we need to think a little bit more about making those capability investments. And we continue to do so. We continue to ensure that we are modernizing the force, including doing things like long-range precision fires and actions that would improve the survivability of our force to potential Chinese attack. But I want to talk a little bit about how it is we are going to pay for this. At the end of the day, a balanced approach seeks to have an even element of readiness, capability, and capacity. And so part of how we're going to manage this is we are going to size and shape and posture forces in certain respects for different war fights. In part because we're not solely focused on the Indo-Pacific as the one thing that we need to focus on, but also a wider array of global challenges. So we recognize that the Army has a very important role to play in any joint force fight, to include air and missile defense, logistics, force protection. But there is an undeniable need for the Army in Europe, particularly for heavy armored forces. So we're going to shape and size the Army for that specific warfight in addition to supporting the Indo-Pacific challenge. We are going to focus some of our naval forces and air forces on the Indo-Pacific and use the Marine Corps as our crisis response force. And by doing that, that's how we're going to start to pay some of the effects that we've seen and try and balance out all three of those levers. Because ultimately, a balanced approach is really trying to balance risk over time. We are planning to respond to the challenges today while meeting the challenges of tomorrow. And already we've seen that there are unforeseen events that we're not planning for that are completely upending the strategies, as Chris's infinite offset has found and as Stacey's competition strategy has found. Neither of them have been up to the challenge, but a balanced approach is, and that's why you should adopt this strategy for this next 4 years.
Okay, thank you, Becca. We're going to bring up our National Defense Strategy Commission, and to help them in their questioning, I'm going to read a couple of awesome comments from Twitter. Again, use hashtag Chris. You know what? You were so far behind in the votes last time that I wasn't sure that you were still competing. Just kidding, of course, my mistake. I won't read any of the comments on Twitter before we go anywhere. In fact, let's hear your pitch to the commission, and then comments from Twitter are coming. So, folks, if you put in some right now, I'll have even more to say when we switch to the commission. Chris, go ahead. I'm really sorry.
What you don't realize is I actually invested in forms of quantum stealth technology during the last turn. So I was in between points in the quantum realm. You couldn't find me. But no, in all seriousness, what we've done here is we've broken with what was a promising strategy to actually compete with China long term, and we focused on near term places. And frankly, we focused our strategy on an area of significant Chinese strength, and that is the presence of naval and air forces in their backyard. And the premise of Stacey's strategy is essentially that if we put a lot more of our forces in their backyard, that somehow this will radically alter the balance of power. And the problem with that is that the total size of our fleet at best is going to be 300 and some odd ships, barring a massive shift in priority towards shipbuilding. And the same thing, frankly, applies to the Air Force. There's no way we're going to be able to go number for number, ship for ship, aircraft for aircraft against China in their own backyard. So this is just, right, this is a strategy to nowhere. This is just a way to burn readiness, to burn fuel, turn it into carbon dioxide, while proving Archimedes' principle that yes, ships can in fact displace water. I don't understand what the ultimate goal here is, but I'm sure there is one. It's probably just driving our fleet into the bottom of the ocean. And frankly, the balance strategy is not much better. At the end of the day, both of these strategies are essentially like running up a huge bill on your credit card. Yes, you can do stuff in the near term, and yes, you can buy a lot of things, and you'll seem extremely flush with cash. And then eventually the bill will come due, and it'll come due with interest. And what we see in China's investment strategy is a way for them to make us pay that interest. They are going for a technology-focused strategy that's going to drive a new revolution in military affairs focused on all the technologies that I was advocating for. And they're going to surpass us, not just in East Asia, but potentially globally if we don't change course and go back to technology investment. I can't say this strongly enough. I mean, ultimately, what we're doing is, under a fixed budget top line, we're squeezing risk in different places. And what I would advocate for is a strategy where we're trying to buy down some of the risk in the future, because that's where, based on the current trends, the risk to the United States and our allies and partners in the region gets most acute. And China gets this. If you listen to what the China player just said, that's what they're trying to do. And if we don't match that, we're going to find ourselves in a deep, deep hole. Back to you, Shai.
Thank you, Chris. And I appreciate your patience with me jumping ahead before. Our first Twitter comment has a Star Wars reference, so hopefully that makes up for it. David on Twitter says, everybody loves the easy button, lightsabers for everyone. So we've got that comment there. And then Connell, also on Twitter, again, everyone use the hashtag CNAS 2021. Aggressive works, but we really should have picked a more balanced approach. And as we lead up to that next vote, we're going to bring up our National Defense Strategy Commission. And Sarah, starting with you. We'll go Sarah, Eric, and then Bob. Sarah, starting with you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you. At this time point, which I believe now is 2029.
2029.
2029. This is for Chris. The DoD hasn't historically been great at picking winners and losers in advanced technology, both in the areas of advanced technology in which to invest and specifically the actual winners and losers that produce these kinds of capabilities. Has your strategy from the beginning of these moves to 2029 been able to kind of provide a framework to have robust technology injection and insertion? And what did you do to be able to ensure that?
So I think we can focus on some of the failures that DoD has had, but if you expand your aperture a little bit broader, DoD has actually sparked remarkable innovations in military technology for the development of nuclear submarines, stealth aircraft, precision guided munitions. DoD actually does have a pretty strong record in some cases of doing some pretty incredibly innovative things. Does it work always? No. But that's why you need to have a broad-based portfolio approach to developing technologies, where you're not just betting on a single technology, nor are you betting on a single firm to develop that technology, but much as a prudent investment portfolio manager would do, you're balancing your investments across a range of potentially revolutionary technologies and across a range of different ways of doing it, whether that's investing in things like the research laboratories or partnering with private firms. And I think that approach has served the United States well for decades, certainly stretching back to World War II. And I think it can serve us well going far into the 21st century. But the key thing here is we actually have to get back to that strategy. And we can't kind of seesaw back and forth between a strategy focused on future technology development and then seesaw back to a strategy focused on near-term interventions in the East China Sea using extant ships and capability. We have to stay the course because technology takes time to develop. It's not, we snap our fingers overnight and we've got, autonomous, robots and artificially intelligent command and control networks. We have to spend the time and the resources necessary to bring those capabilities into the force. And we have an opportunity here to shift the balance back in the U.S. advantage, provided that we can only go back to an offset approach. But otherwise, we're just going to find ourselves, much as Churchill once said about going bankrupt, we're going to go there slowly and then all at once.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Chris. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Becca, you've got some momentum there. In your initial presentation, there were a lot of alsos. We've got a budget with diminishing purchase power. What aren't we doing anymore with these things that are being added to DoD mission? And the second part of this question is, you're advocating for the balanced approach. DoD hasn't always gotten balance right. Do you think you're starting in a balanced position? And if not, what adjustments would you make?
Those are great questions. Thank you. So, I do recognize that in some respects, we're adding more, or at least seemingly adding more missions. We are focusing on a few different regions, the Arctic, for example, and we are also doubling down on acknowledging the threats that we genuinely face, like climate change and bio threats. In some respects, I would argue that these aren't new missions, that instead they are just being prioritized more. But at the end of the day, we are making some of those hard trade-offs when it comes down to capabilities, readiness, and also our capacity. Part of this is some of the sizing and shaping of the various services within the joint force for the different warfights that I talked about, in my impassioned plea for a balanced approach. Some of this is also saying that we are not going to focus perhaps as heavily as the infinite offset on future slaughter bots, but instead looking at technologies that are proven to work and making more of those incremental enhancements. So in that respect, we're trying to manage to just shift around our resources and marshal them a bit differently than perhaps we have in the past, to be able to do what seems like more, but it's actually not quite. And then to your second question about, are we starting from a position of balance? I would say no. And part of this is because the audience and our participants, as wise and smart as they may be, they've gone with two poor choices for the past 8 years, trying to adopt strategies that are over-optimized for either a specific mission or a specific threat, or trying to think about what the solution to that threat might be in all the wrong ways. So what balanced approach is trying to do is bring balance back to the fore in a way in which we haven't had for the past 8 years, but hopefully we will have for the next 4.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Becca. Thank you so much, Eric. Bob, the floor is yours. And I'm not going to try to predict your question this time like last time. So over to you.
Well, this has been a really great back and forth. And then again, a question for all three of the strategists. If I'm a Chinese strategist, I'm saying, wow, I've got the Americans right where I want them. I've got the initiative. They're thinking about changing their strategy every 4 years. So they're in a tail chase. We've got the initiative, and they're trying to anticipate what we're going to do next. So I wanted to ask all three of the strategists, and I know this is an artifact of the game, and I really love it. This has been really fun, and also draws out an awful lot of the issues facing the department now. But do you worry about us trying to change strategies every 4 years rather than just sticking with a strategy and making adjustments at the margins to accommodate real world events?
All right, why don't we take that in the order in which in the winners order of the previous round. So we'll start with Stacy, and then to Becca, and then to Chris.
Thanks, Shai. Obviously, the whipsawing between different strategies is not really a very good approach, and likely to lead to a lot of disturbances. I think that, however, staying with a strategy that is proven to have significant vulnerabilities is also problematic. The United States often, it seems like, refuses to make some of the hard choices that it needs to, and to really just jump around and respond to events that occur. So change may happen for different reasons, and at times it may be rational, and at other times it may be the result of a lack of strategic discipline, which is what you want to avoid. But it's careful to assess what's really driving, the situation and the change, so that you don't introduce significant vulnerabilities at any point, which is what I've been arguing, that in the near term, we're not taking the steps that we need to shore up deterrence and the balance in the Indo-Pacific. We're not investing in the right munitions. We're not pushing our forces forward. We're not taking steps to improve the resiliency of our bases. All of that needs to happen so that we can remain and be there and compete day to day.
Thank you, Stacy. Okay, over to Becca.
All right. Well, I definitely agree, Bob, with sort of your starting premise. And I do think that there's value in having consistency across strategies. But that being said, sometimes there's a need to address the strategy on the fly in order to figure out sort of what works and what doesn't work. And I think, throughout the course of the past 8 years, we've seen some things that have not worked. And we might see a few things that work. So part of why a balanced approach is really the way to go here is because it has continuity with both of the previous strategies, the competition strategy and the infinite offset strategy, but the right continuities. In some respects, a balanced approach is really the best of all worlds for the environment that we face today, but also for the environment that we face tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, Chris, over to you.
So Bob has touched on a really critical issue here, which is the need for strategic continuity. In many ways, shifting strategies willy-nilly is probably even worse than picking a bad strategy and sticking with it. Which I would strongly argue that the competition and the balanced strategy are both poor strategies for achieving our end states and our objectives vis-a-vis China in the long-term competition. But one of the difficulties of the infinite offset strategy is a need for a little bit of discipline in the near term in order to make the necessary investments in order to have these capabilities come to fruition. And if we do that in this round, I think we will see a significant uptick in U.S. capability and a shift in the balance of power in East Asia back in the favor of the United States. If we don't do it, the competition's not over, but we're going to have to spend the next 3 decades digging ourselves out of a technological hole and trying to regain the advantage vis-a-vis China, which is going to be quite difficult, and it could take multiple decades. But nevertheless, it's an excellent point, and it reflects the difficulty in both selecting and implementing a strategy. Back to you, Shai.
All right, folks, you have heard from our strategists. You have seen them be grilled by the National Defense Strategy Commission. It is time to vote. We're going to give you a nice, good amount of time to vote because this is it. This is your last vote on a strategy. But remember, there's still one more vote coming in the term for the implementation of the strategy. And while the votes are coming in, I want to get a chance to chat with our NDS Commission, our NDS commissioners. I'd love to do a really quick round robin with your impressions of the audience decision making so far. How do you think the audience is doing? What's your evaluation? And Sarah, I want to throw one extra thing because I don't know if I'll have time to ask you about this, but you do have so much expertise in the area of nuclear weapons and there has been some stuff in the chat about WMDs. I would love to know as part of your answer, if anyone else wants to get in on that too, but I would love to know as part of your answer how we still have 2 nuclear powers playing this game against each other, how that might be affecting the decision making. But again, the main question is, how is the audience doing? And I'll start with Sarah.
Yeah, I think the audience is doing great. This is a really innovative way to try to do a war game, and requires a lot of patience of everybody behind the scenes and out in the audience. But what's really fascinating is the interaction that is clearly going on between kind of the Twitter hashtags, the active voting, and all of the comments. So I think the audience is doing great. I think the audience, quite frankly, when you just look at the decisions that are being made, they're reasonable decisions. And I think they reflect what could very likely be a scenario. And Bob just kind of talked about this. And the one thing that, Bob's question really kind of touched on the last round, that maybe it's just because of where I worked, but I think it's also an inherently political question, right? The choice about strategy and the balance that we're going to make in what kinds of levers we're going to be pulling, how heavily we're going to be relying on other instruments of national power, what the strategic priorities and the subsequent programmatics of that is going to look like. Quite frankly, it's not just the executive branch that plays in that discourse. And so there's a layer or a lens of politics that would get laid over kind of all of these time epics and these moves as well. And so that's, again, may just be from where I sit and where I stand. But I just wanted to throw that out there. As far as nuclear weapons, first of all, I think both of the gentlemen up on this panel with me also are tremendously capable of talking about that. It is one of the questions that constantly comes to mind in these kinds of war games when you deal with China, because I think there is, and will continue to be within these timeframes, a real risk of strategic miscalculation. A real risk that they don't understand, and that we have not fostered a rigorous taxonomy and discourse about what red lines look like, if there should be red lines, what kinds of systems would be tripped in that kind of a context. And I mean, it's a tremendously complicated thing to try to play in these war games. But in every single one of the war games that I've had the privilege of doing with CNAS, there was always a very strong commentary on the side about, like, why didn't we play nuclear command and control? Why didn't we play more kind of nuclear escalatory options? It's fascinating. But a lot of times I also think that it needs to be placed in the context of the broader objectives of the war game and the broader objectives of the national security kind of discourse that we're trying to have.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, we'll get to our results momentarily, but again, I really want to take advantage of this amazing panel on our National Defense Strategy Commission. So, Eric, how are the audience decisions? And if you want to comment on the nuclear angle as well, would love to hear it.
I think, well, it's interesting. The shift in the vote from the first vote to the second vote surprised me a little bit. I think it underscores the point Chris made about the discipline you need when you have a long-term strategy. And also something Sarah said earlier about the fact that it isn't just a DoD decision. I think DoD could really up its game in how it interacts with Congress earlier, and I think more openly. Because what ends up happening, and we're kind of seeing it here, is there's a lot of pressure put on the department to do all three strategies, or the balanced plus strategy, and do more than it's funded to do. But I think it's been interesting to watch the audience. I'm eager to see what the next results will be.
Thanks so much. And all right, over to Bob. Oh, you're on mute. Hang on. I think we got to unmute you, Bob.
What I'm really anxious to do, Shai, is get access to the Twitter feed and the comments. We cannot see them on the commission, and I think there'll be a lot of very interesting things in there. But what I like to say is, I think what the audience has shown is that strategy is an art. It's not a science. If we just had Chris give a presentation, I think many in the audience would say, that sounds totally right, and we ought to go after infinite offset. But then 5 days later, we could have Stacy give the competition strategy, and everyone would say, "Oh man, I didn't think of that. That is exactly the way I'd go." And then 5 days later, Becca would be able to convince us that the balance strategy is by all means the right one. So I think the audience has been acting very rationally and in response to what they are hearing. As I said, I bet you there's a lot of insights in the Twitter feeds and things like that. I can't wait to see them.
We can get you those after the fact. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
As far as the nuclear side of the house is, strategic deterrence is changing in a big way. There are so many different types of strategic attack vectors on the homeland right now and on U.S. interests and allies. There's the nuclear overhang. There's what the Russians call non-strategic nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. Both the Chinese and the Russians have different views on how to use those. There's bioweapons, as demonstrated by the most recent pandemic. If you start combining AI with biotechnology, you can really get into some scary scenarios. There are the cyber attacks, which we have seen on the U.S. Critical infrastructure, and there are attacks in space and attacks in undersea infrastructure like our cables. All of these things have different escalatory ladders. The Telemus Group has looked at this a lot, and they say it's almost, you have to think of deterrence now as a lattice, where each of the ladders are crossing, and you might be taking actions that you think are de-escalating on one escalatory ladder, which are actually escalating on a different one. And, in the early part of the 50s, when nuclear weapons became a thing, we spent a lot of intellectual time thinking about deterrence and the escalation ladder. And we simply haven't done that to respond to all of these new things. So I think your point on the nuclear has to be expanded a little, Shai, to talk about strategic attack and how do we deter strategic attacks. And it is getting more and more difficult. And it's very, very important.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for expanding my question beyond what I was asking. That's so great. Okay. We now have our responses for the 2029 National Defense Strategy. Drum roll. Becca has pulled ahead with the balance strategy, 39%.
Woo, woo, woo.
Competition, another dramatic fall from first place. It seems like first place. That's a dynamic that I would love to hear about from our commissioners later in the discussion. But first place to the bottom each time, and then the infinite offset in the middle with 36%. But of course, reality is now going to set in, and reality is brought to us by Ed McGrady. Ed, who is, by the way, doing triple duty, adjudicating this game and also in the chat answering every possible question. Ed, what is happening now that the balanced approach has been chosen?
Well, some reality has been brought to you. Apparently, the Russians' new Laika-class submarine has achieved acoustic parity with the U.S. submarine forces. This is a big deal for the U.S. because subsurface dominance is one of the key areas in which we just overwhelm all of our competitors in the competition at sea. And so losing this acoustic parity is not a good thing. It will take some work to achieve to re-achieve parity, or else you risk actually falling behind in a very critical naval capability. So let's go to Chris, then Becca, to see what some of your options are for dealing with this incredibly disturbing development.
So while I may not agree with the decision to pursue a balanced approach, I think we now have a chance to rectify that mistake retroactively. And that is to pursue course of action A, which is a crash investment program to regain undersea superiority, which is really the bedrock of our naval capability vis-a-vis both China and Russia. And if you think this technology that the Russians have won't eventually find its way into the hands of the Chinese, you haven't been paying attention to their ability to steal intellectual property and incorporate it into their force. So I think the real concern here is that sort of the core strength of the U.S. naval forces in combat with China or Russia could rapidly no longer be a strength. And it's not just about conventional combat. Per the conversation we just had about strategic deterrence, this puts our strategic submarines at risk. Our SSBNs, our nuclear ballistic missile submarines at risk. So what this program of course of action A is going to do is accelerate the development of a next generation attack submarine to replace the Virginia class, upgrade our current submarines with new towed sonar arrays, and also improve the tiles, the anti-acoustic tiles that are on all our submarines. And then it'll also upgrade all the sensors on our anti-submarine aircraft, both the fixed wing Poseidons, but also the rotary wing helicopters that we launch off of destroyers and aircraft carriers. Hopefully, over 5 to 10 years, this could shift the acoustic balance back toward a U.S. advantage, which is I really can't emphasize enough how critical this is to our ability to compete at sea.
Well, my colleague seems to be panicking just a little bit with something that, yes, it's unfortunate that this happened. This isn't quite ideal, but there is no need to completely, lose the plot on what our strategy is all about just because China has managed to make a technological advance. Here, I actually think that making incremental improvements to our anti-submarine warfare training and to upgrade some of the acoustic tiles on, some number of our submarines is sufficient for us to maintain parity and then, over time, continue to make those incremental upgrades in order to hopefully regain superiority. At the end of the day, we can't go all in on technology all the time. In doing so, we're going to forget about readiness and forget about trying to retain some of those really critical elements of capacity that we need to be able to compete and also potentially defeat China. So here, I also just want to raise that we don't want to get into the habit of constantly trying to respond to any action that China has, including technological advancements in the military domain, because ultimately then we're going to be going tit for tat on modernization. And what is that going to net us in the long run? So instead, making incremental advancements to enhance our capabilities, enhance our ability to, compete at sea and also deter at sea, potentially even defeat at sea, is sufficient for what it is we're trying to do.
All right. Thank you so much, audience. This is your last vote, but not the end of our session, but your last vote of today. Make it count. Vote A with Chris's approach or vote B with Becca's approach. And while those votes are tallying, China, Team China, the Beijing team, has been making its decisions about its strategy, and they are going to come up and brief you while you are making your decision on your vote and how you're going to respond with the implementation of your strategy. Jake, representing Team Beijing, take it away.
Thanks, Shai, and hello for a final time from Beijing. As we look at what Washington is doing, China is sticking with its technological leapfrog strategy. Going forward, we're looking to take advantage of U.S. geopolitical overstretch and probably more importantly, inattention. In this way, balance is the best strategy for China because it pulls American strategic attention to other regions, other topics, and it doesn't commit to the level of investment needed to maintain the world's most powerful military where it matters, in the Indo-Pacific region, specifically vis-a-vis the pacing threat from us here in China. And so in preparing for everything, it's not really optimized for anything. And so for us, we see this as an extension or potentially a second period of strategic opportunity where China can make advancements while the U.S. is focused on other things. The additional signal it sends to us is that our system's ability to practice strategic discipline is a major advantage, and especially in comparison to the U.S., where looking at 3 strategies over 3 cycles, the U.S. has chosen to do exactly the opposite. So at this point, China has caught up, and we're now poised to pull ahead in the military technological race. Therefore, we're not going to look back. We're going to keep running full speed ahead. And that's our plan, especially because Washington, again, is not really truly focused on the race that we're running. And so we're going to continue to focus on technology and being able to ensure our security at home, especially within the first island chain. And strategically over time, that will mean if we can really be secure there, then we'll be safer projecting power in subsequent decades later on. And then as it relates to potential technological breakthroughs from our friends in Moscow, we're pretty confident that our technology acquisition system that uses a combination of buying, borrowing, and stealing can help us sort of be a fast follower in all these basic technologies that are developed by other competitors, but also it validates what we've done in Beijing, which is investing in those breakthrough technologies ourselves so that we're not falling behind and being subject to strategic shock in the way the US has been. So we, again, feel like we're in a good position to achieve the goals we've set out for ourselves by 2035 and eventually by 2049, and we might even exceed them. So we feel like we're in a strong position. Back to you, Shai.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I believe you will reappear as your actual self later. Thank you for all the great work you've been doing. While we're waiting, I'd love to bring up the National Defense Strategy Commission, because our master adjudicator, just kidding. Our master adjudicator, man, he's so fast. Ed, he's in multiple places at once. Ed, over to you. Where are we now in 2029?
Well, let's take a look at the screen. You certainly have tried out every possible strategy in this game, starting with the IO, then moving to competition, and then finally balance. What the balance strategy did for you was it increased your readiness. And I put, whoops. Okay, I see what the problem is. I've stopped sharing. I need to reshare my screen. Just a second.
No problem, Ed.
Hold
no
on.
problem, Ed.
We have clearly not achieved screen sharing technology by this time.
While we bring the screen up,
on.
I want to note something that there's a point in the chat and I'm throwing this to Stacy to keep for our for when the conversation starts. I feel like this is an important thing. Is we were asked a few times, but there's so many things in the chat. We were asked a few times about the role of Russia and how Russia should be calculated into this, even so being as far as to say that we neglected Russia. And so when we do the after action report, I think that'll be something that will be critical for us to talk about. But suspense there now, because Ed is up with the screen. Ed, where are we in the world?
Let's take a look at our map. This screen share technology seems to continue to defy me every turn. And that's why you didn't see much change last time, I suspect, is because I have to reshare my screen every time. So what you see here, and I put little orange arrows to show you what has changed. You chose the balance strategy. The balance strategy increased your readiness and allowed you to maintain your position with respect to the various island chains. But at the same time, that little dust up with the Russia technology came along, and you reprogrammed a lot of resources into maintaining or exceeding parity on subsurface technology, which boosted your capability. Unfortunately, something again had to pay for that, and it was readiness. So even though the balance strategy got you back a little readiness, you ate it back as you were trying to build back your capability in the subsurface regime. But at the same time, China surged ahead a little bit in terms of technology. They chose to increase their capability, but the combination of your having more capacity along with your having superior technology has now allowed you to sort of push back in to the first island chain even, and continue to hold the second island chain, and begin to challenge China in those regions with your new technologies. And because of that, you have, again, increased risk, because I don't think China is going to accept this as the terms go forward. And that risk is having to actually fight a conventional conflict with China. And in that case, China has increased its capability as well. So you're kind of capability parity. You have a little bit more capacity. And so how that conflict would go would be kind of up in the air right now. So moving forward in the future, I think the U.S. has to ask, how much does it want to continue pressure China in the first and second island chains? How much does it want to continue to invest in capability to stay ahead, or at least at parity with China? And then for China, how much do you want to increase your capacity? China has a large economy and it can increase its capacity relatively quickly. So if it does that, then where does that place the U.S.? These are all trade-offs that you have to make as decision makers. How consistent do you want to be in your strategy? What kind of strategy you want to build compared to what kind of strategy your competitors are building? And what are actions with respect to supporting friends and allies in a region that's contested going to do in terms of increasing the overall risk given your relative capabilities? We haven't decided that in this game. The game continues. But I think it shows a little bit about what some of the key trade-offs are and some of the key challenges are in this situation. Anyway, back to Shai.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for the masterful work behind the scenes and for the update on the strategic environment. We are now going to transition, bring up Stacy Pettyjohn, Senior Fellow, Director of the Defense Program here at CNAS, to take us to our post-game show. In this situation, I will turn the mic over to Stacy, and I'll just be here to read out some cool audience comments or questions whenever you need me. Stacy, and congratulations to the whole team that put this together and to the amazing production team that's working behind the scenes on this. This has been so much fun and so interesting. And I tip my hat to you and the defense team and all the other folks participating. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Shai. Thank you for being a wonderful moderator, and to the production team for doing a fantastic job. This has been amazing. And to our NDS commissioners for being such a difficult and challenging audience that helped us to think through some of the trade-offs associated with these different strategies. So the game's over now, breaking out of character, not going to be advocating for competition anymore, and we're going to stand back and have a hot wash, which is typically the most important part of any game. We try to take stock of what we learned from this experience, what might actually reflect reality in a game, because we know it's an artificial environment and there are a lot of things that are not realistic within it. Some of those may have an impact, and we want to be sure to identify some of those artificialities, and also the lessons that we do think are important and that we should take with us going forward and probably further investigate. So to do this, I'm going to start with Chris and Becca, and then I'm going to pull in our NDS commissioners a little bit later on and try to pay attention to what's going on in the chat too. So we'll see how well I can multitask. Starting things off with Becca, then I'll ask Chris the same question. How do you think the game went for the United States?
You know, all told, the U.S. didn't do that badly when it came to the competition with China. There was a little bit of a frenetic back and forth, particularly between the strategies selected for move 1 and move 2. I would say that in many respects, infinite offset and competition are sort of polar opposites. But all that being said, at the end of the day, the map didn't look too poorly in terms of U.S. gains. there is an argument that, maintaining strategic discipline, sticking with the same strategy throughout the time period of this game would have produced better results. But at the same time, there's also a risk when it comes down to picking a bad strategy. Even if you are consistent, that will not get you out of, the poor elements of any strategic approach. I would also just say that, some of the choices made in the game today really demonstrate how difficult the readiness issue is. And, I think that element is there across all three of the strategies that we played today. But, big kudos to the players. You guys did a pretty remarkable job. We've play tested this quite a lot as part of our game development. And, we've done different combinations of strategies that we've selected and played. And a lot of times we end up with a US strategy that doesn't do as well vis-a-vis China. So, big ups to you guys. You did a really great job today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Becca. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody who helped put this on, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. This is a lot of fun, and the audience was critical because you comprised the stochasticity of this event, right? You're the random element that makes this live and interesting for us. I think the end result for the United States was acceptable, especially given the strategic bouncing that we did from one to the next. I think we kind of got a little bit of a Hail Mary throw there at the end through the investments in undersea technology, which I think gave the United States an advantage in capability that's actually quite relevant for competition with China, but it happened sort of at the very tail end there. I am particularly concerned, though, if you look at the balance of where China is going, they clearly think, at least in this game, and this isn't too far off from reality if you read the work. I would encourage everybody to check out Bob's Chinese offset or offset strategies with Chinese characteristics, his CNAS paper he wrote a couple years ago with Greg Grant on this very topic, which is that China thinks that they can win the long-term technology competition with the United States. And I think what you saw out of Jacob in his decision-making was that once we went away from pursuing our own technology offsets, they believed that they could win that competition. And so if we were to play this game out a couple more turns, I would be seriously concerned about the balance of capability and what that means, not just inside the first island chain and second island chain, but what that means on sort of a sort of aggregate force on force level between the United States and China, which I think if we were to do that would not look so good.
Thanks, Chris. Everyone in the audience, thank you for participating. Please continue to throw questions in the chat. We'll try to incorporate them. Towards that end, Shai had previously mentioned that, how does Russia fit into this? And that is clearly one of the areas that we abstracted away and that we didn't address directly. We had to simplify things to make a game that was playable in a certain amount of time. And Russia was one of those factors that just became an event that could pop up, but that was not the focus and did not have as much autonomy to make its own decisions. So when you involve Russia and the fact that the United States is trying to balance two different great power competitors at the same time in different regions that at times require different types of capabilities, it becomes even more complicated and challenging. My perspective on the game and how the United States fared is that we did better than we would have maybe, but I think I'm pessimistic. And this gets to the next question that I want to start with, Becca. How does this game differ from reality?
I think there's a bunch of different ways in which this differs from reality. We obviously had these unforeseen events that could pop up. But, in some respects, this game sort of takes place in a vacuum. It takes place in the vacuum of the Indo-Pacific for the most part. So, in truth, you actually have a lot of different events going on concurrently, and you have responsibilities across the globe, and you're looking at that global map as opposed to just a regional one. I also think that, some of the differentiation that we really tried to get to in terms of strategy and implementation we tried to represent this in the game, but in reality, it's much more stark. I think looking at the 2018 NDS, it's a fine strategy, but it seemingly faltered in its implementation because there was a lot of whipsawing back and forth. There was this idea that, you were going to focus on strategic competition with China and Russia, and then to a lesser extent Russia, but then we ended up tying up a ton of time and resources in the Middle East. So, that's just one example where strategy and implementation sometimes work cross purposes. And we tried to get at this a little bit in the game, but probably not as much as you would see in real life.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would point out is that the strategies presented here were simplified. So much as we kind of eliminated Russia as a strategic competitor, we narrowed down these strategies until they were basically almost caricatures of themselves. And in reality, every strategy would have little bits and pieces of each of them. You probably wouldn't see such a stark tech forward investment, and nor would you see a strategy like the competition strategy, where it's all about keeping a bunch of ships ready and aircraft ready and pushing them out into the first island chain to push back on Chinese maritime militia. But there would be bits and pieces of all of these interconnected. The question is the balance among them and where you want to place your risk bets. And I think the competition strategy obviously said, look, we're going to place all the risk bets on the near term. The offset strategy said, look, we're going to place them all in the long term. And the balance strategy said, look, we're going to try to paper over everything. But I think that is ultimately a decision made early on in the strategy when you're trying to do this, is where do we think that the moment of sort of maximum risk is. And when we were looking in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, we thought it was the sort of like 7 to 10 year time frame. So back in 2018, that would have been 2025 to roughly 2030. But I certainly think other people could have different interpretations. There are some who believe that we're in sort of an era of maximum risk right now, or there are some who believe that the era of maximum risk could be out in the 2035 to 2049 timeframe if China actually makes good on all of its investments in artificial intelligence. Really, that can be in the eye of the beholder, but ultimately that drives your decision making about how you're going to deal with the threat. Even if you come to the agreement that China is the number one, pacing challenge, I think most people agree with at this point, which I got to be honest, not the case when we were writing the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And I think when it comes to Russia, it's a difficult problem because Russia is neither a regional threat like in Iran or North Korea, nor is it the same class of challenge that China presents. And so it's sort of this awkward in between where it is in some cases a peer with the United States, particularly when it comes to strategic forces. But in other cases, it's very much not a peer of the United States in terms of its conventional capabilities or its economy, its architecture or constellation of allies and partners, which is extremely limited. So I think we have to craft a strategy that treats Russia as a sui generis phenomena, not as China minus, nor as like Iran DPRK plus. And I think that will be a key issue for the next national defense strategy.
Thanks, Chris. I think you're right. Time horizons and balancing risk across time is one of the most difficult issues that we face. And typically, at least in the past few years, probably decade or so, we've tended to prioritize the near term and all the near term crises, challenges, and threats, and not been able to think about the long term. And obviously, even you can't just focus on the long term like Infinite Offset did. You would have to take steps to mitigate some of the near term risk and double down, though you're going to have to make some choices about what you do and don't do. And that's where, in reality, we've run into some problems. If I could bring in the NDS commissioners again and ask them the same questions, how do they think the game went for the United States, and how does this differ from reality in important ways? Starting with Sarah, if she is brought up, or if not, we will switch course. Oh, there we go.
I'm here.
So starting. Same questions to you. What are your thoughts on how this went for the United States and how this differs from the real world?
Yeah, for the United States, I think this was, I think it went fine. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that kind of strategic lack of discipline is something that people deal with all the time, right? People in the bureaucracy, people in politics for a long time understand where there are consistent threads that come through national security strategies and national defense strategies, and they understand how to look at those threads through different lenses given where they sit and who they're supporting at the time. But I think they also are aware of the general pulse of where that discourse is going to go. And so what was interesting here is, in the beginning, what you had was a balanced approach, and then you had two relatively extreme approaches. And what the audience chose to do is feel out those extremes before coming back to the balance, right? And I think that is something that happens, quite frankly. I think it happens in, developing strategies. I think it happens in just human relationships. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there are a lot of things that probably got abstracted away for the sake of gameplay. And you have to do that because there's only so much time, right? I am a huge space nerd, right? That's like what I do. I do space, missile defense, nukes, lasers, hypersonics, right? We touched a little bit of that, but like there was no space play. Like by 2029, there's going to be some space play. There's going to be some real space play, and it's going to be in weird ways that I think heretofore we may not have seen. I think, clearly alliances, the strength of alliances, the challenges of trying to negotiate alliances, the challenges of having to work within alliance constructs to be able to increase force presence, right? I mean, that is something that I think really got simplified and abstracted away. Clearly, like the role of the interagency in the development of a defense strategy and a national security strategy, right? Looking at State Department, looking at, within the executive branch and kind of all of that, but also looking again at Congress as a co-equal branch of the government and what they would say and how their perspectives would be reflected in both authorizing and appropriating language. And quite frankly, authorizing and appropriating language may not always be the same, right? And so that adds another layer of complexity. So I think there was a lot there that quite frankly needed to be simplified because there was no way that you could deal with all of that in the time constraint. And quite frankly, with the fluidity of how this game was kind of designed and architected. And I think it still got at, the objectives of what you were trying to do, but surely there are a lot of other vectors and lenses to look through to think about, how a national defense strategy would get created. And I guess the last thing is there was probably an oversimplification on kind of the threat perspective and how much the threat drives this, right? As a former Intel person, I start a lot of my conversations about baselining and understanding what the threat is. And I think that was implied in a lot of the original pitches and kind of brought through with Jacob coming in. But I think that would have been a much more robust discussion when developing a strategy like this.
Those are really interesting points. Thanks, Sarah. I'm definitely with you on the threat. And after I go to Eric and Bob, I'm going to ask Jake to come in and talk a little bit about what China is doing in the real world and how his play might have differed from what we see there and what we could expect from China in the future. Really taken by the space thing too. I don't really know what competition in space is going to look like in the future. I feel like we get some hints of it where we see, what the Russian satellite was doing, or stalking an American one recently. And I'm not sure we totally understand warfighting in space either. So these are really important issues that deserve further exploration. Eric, what are your key takeaways?
Well, I would say probably first of all, I think I'm aligned with Chris here. I think the United States did fine. I think it's much more interesting and maybe even taking this vector out to see what happens in the 2030s and how the strategy we settled on carries us through that decade. One of the things, and Sarah touched on it, that I think is an important component of what's different in reality versus a war game is the role of Congress. And the good news and the bad news is it's really hard to shift a strategy, specifically to realign resource against what a new strategy might be, or a change in strategy. So the interesting movement of the 3 votes is a really hard thing to implement in a budget. And I know that's pretty hard to put in a war game, but just something to think about in terms of almost imposing discipline on the process, but also making it hard to make some of those changes and adjustments that I think we identified today.
Thanks, Eric. That's exactly true. You and Sarah both brought up Congress, and rightly so. We've seen, and I think one of the biggest potential challenges the Biden administration is going to face is that their plan is involving divest to invest. And so they're going to have to convince the skeptical members on the Hill that this is the right course of action, and that they have mitigated the risks. They're going to develop and field new capabilities in reasonable timelines that perform as expected, and that we can afford to retire some existing capabilities that are either so old that they're too expensive to maintain anymore, or not as useful for the priority threats that the United States is focused on right now. Bob, what did you take away from this exercise? Still mute.
I said, first of all, I really enjoyed it. I wasn't certain what to expect. I mean, I had all the paperwork and all of that stuff, but I was very interested to see how this would play out in real time. And as several of you have noted, you have to pick what you want to get to, and you design your game in that way, and there are things that fall out. I personally don't think the United States did well at all. If I read Ed's assessment correctly, the Chinese have achieved military technical parity in 2029. That's right around the corner. The Chinese had hoped to surpass the United States by 2049, when they wanted to become the #1 military power in the world. But based on our choices, it appears as though the Chinese have at least caught up with us in the military technical sense only 8 years from now. And that is not a good place for the United States to be. Since the end of World War II, our national strategies, our national defense strategies, the cornerstone of those strategies has been an assumption of military technical superiority over our most likely, or I should say, the most pressing rival. So I don't think we ended up very good at all. Now, as I said, what this shows is you have so many choices in a strategy. And I think it shows just what a delicate place the United States is right now. We are in a long-term competition that's going to be the hardest that we've ever faced. Regardless of what assumptions you make about Chinese capabilities we've never been up against a competitor that would have a larger economy than our own. And right now, all of the projections are the Chinese will most likely surpass us in absolute GDP right in the 28-29 timeframe. They've already surpassed us in purchasing power parity. And we've never faced any competitor that was better than us technologically. So this is a race that has an existential outcome. This is the United States being knocked off as the #1 military power in the world, and then the leader of technological innovation in the world. So as I said, I wasn't happy with the outcome of the game, but that's the brakes of naval air. Now, here are some recommendations on the game itself. And I just wrote these down. I'll be happy to talk with you about them. I think in the setup, it would be good to talk about the budget assumptions. What are the budget assumptions? And just say, we're going to start at 2021, 715 billion, and we will accept the Office of Management and Budget projections for the next 10 years, which are a 2% year-over-year growth between 23 and 26, and 1% year-over-year growth thereafter, which means this is not a flat budget. The Department of Defense is losing purchasing power every year, year over year, throughout the entire 2020s. So this is why I would say you have to prioritize. In a situation like this, if you don't have a priority, you will quickly start to lose the bubble. So I think that could be set up a little bit better up front, just so all of the players know what's happening.
That's a really good point, Bob. I think we absolutely should have done that. We were trying to make this flat or declining in real terms budget, so that you had to make the trades. It wasn't just get more money and then you're going to be able to solve your problems. I think we are starting to run out of time. So if you have a few closing remarks, and then I want to leave a little bit of time to go to Jake so we can get the perspective that he had playing China, and then back to Shai to wrap things up.
Yeah, really quick. The descriptions, I mean, the three strategists did a good job in kind of laying out the overall kind of feng shui of the strategy, for lack of a better word. But there could be some things that you would help the audience and the National Defense Commission. So if you force each of the strategists to say, look, this strategy will bias either capacity or capability. Just say, this strategy, this is the bias. If we have to make a choice, this is where we'll go. This strategy will bias near term versus far term, or vice versa. And again, give us all an idea on, okay, if things go, this is where things will happen. And then the third thing, if the strategy works, this is what we expect to see at the end of, say, 2045. The United States is still the dominant Pacific power. It hasn't been kicked out, whatever it might be. If those just three things were told, then I think I would have a lot better idea as a commissioner. Okay, I understand exactly where this strategy is going. And then this is the last one, I promise. I'm sorry, Stacy. Last one is to have Ed give his assessment first, and then ask the three strategists. Okay, and the first question is, would you jettison the strategy? And if you won't, if you don't jettison the strategy, what modifications would you recommend to the President and the Secretary of Defense from this point on? And that way it would get more to what I really think happens. You don't make these abrupt shifts in strategy. You're constantly modifying the strategy based on what's happening in the world. So those are just some recommendations. I thought it was terrific. I had a great time.
That was incredibly helpful feedback. Thank you, Bob. As you know, you always are refining, improving, and adjusting games as you play them different times. And so we will definitely take those to heart. Before we run out of time, I quickly want to pull in Jacob Stokes to talk a little bit about how he played China and how that may or may not differ from what we see China doing today.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, this has been a really fascinating experience to think about it, both from a military perspective, but also from a regionalist and China perspective. I think in many ways, just like the U.S. strategies were perhaps oversimplified, certainly some of this has an oversimplification of what China's ability to play its hand is as well. Of course, China has politics too. The idea that geopolitical strategy making is somehow uncontested in authoritarian systems just isn't quite right. Also, there's the potential that it kind of becomes overly personalized in Xi Jinping himself. In addition, the strategy sort of necessarily has to oversimplify regional politics. Locally, China's assertiveness and even aggression is prompting a level of regional balancing. Look at the Quad. So we didn't, the game doesn't really take into account to the same level what other medium powers are doing in the region. And that's a really important factor, both for military capabilities, but also for security politics writ large. I would also say that even if China wants to focus on a first island chain only strategy, that's going to become less tenable over time as China's pulled out, so to speak, to protect its increasingly sprawling overseas interests. So, you know, that's kind of the downside of Belt and Road in a way. So the potential to become, especially as China becomes more powerful, to get bogged down in places, you know, sort of like the US arguably has over the first 2 decades of this century, that temptation is going to grow for China. I would also say, you know, China's built a lot of, in the real world, has built a lot of 20th century military capabilities very quickly, especially surface ships, and those sustainment costs are going to rise rapidly and start to eat into other accounts. So the kind of offset strategy is going to face, again, a lot of the same pressures that the U.S. defense budget is facing. There's also, in probably for folks who spend a lot of time thinking about the PLA, the hardest thing to measure is the personnel angle. Personnel is going to be a real challenge for China that's quite difficult to work around. And this is going to become more acute as technological capabilities rise. The private sector starts to offer more attractive jobs in China, and there's immense demographic pressures relating to eligible youth. So that's going to be an important factor to watch. Finally, I think one of the things that this game illuminates, especially if both teams are playing a technological leapfrog or offset strategy, is this open question of, you know, where does military technological innovation come from? China, you know, both China and the US are trying to work out this balance between the state and the private sector, and where does innovation of this type come from? But at the end of the day, China is still putting a bigger bet on the role of the state. And so I think that I'm not sure we have an answer to that question yet, but it'll be interesting to watch going forward. So those are just a few observations from me. Thanks, Stacey.
Thanks, Jacob. That's really interesting. There's a lot to dive into there, and we unfortunately don't have as much time as we'd like. From pulling this back to what Sarah had led with earlier, the threat is so important. One of the biggest tests of a strategy is whether it actually strengthens deterrence and prevents a state from deciding to take aggression. And we didn't actually test that here because we did not want to turn this into an operational war game, which would actually test the forces and the force structures that the strategies created to determine how they did in this situation. So we're running out of time here. I want to thank the audience so much for participating. This has been a lot of fun. To Shai for moderating the whole event, to the production team for doing a fabulous job, to the defense team for being wonderful, for Jake playing Red, and to our fantastic NDS commissioners, Sarah Monero, Eric Fanning, and Bob Work. I'm going to turn it back over to Richard Fontaine now to close out the conference.
All right. Thank you, Stacey, and everybody who was involved in playing this this game. That was fantastic. And that's it. We've done it. You've all done it. 6 days across 2 weeks, all virtual. And the CNAS 2021 annual conference now draws to a close. I said at the outset during this conference, we aim to develop good answers to tough national security questions. I hope we've done some of that during these proceedings. That work, of course, will continue. Indeed, in many ways, it's the mission of the Center for New American Security to do precisely that. So watch this space for much more to come. As we do conclude, I'd like to extend another thank you to our conference sponsors, which include American Rheinmetall Defense, Exeger, Google, Huntington Ingalls Industries, Leidos, Microsoft Corporation, Palace Advisors, Qualcomm, and the Boeing Company. Thank our institutional donors as well for making this conference discussion possible, and our media partner Axios, which was a great partnership again this year. And thanks to everybody who spoke during the sessions. Let me just express a special note of gratitude, however, to the CNAS communications team that made all of this possible. Shai Corman, Jasmine Butler, Anna Peterson, Danya Torres. To say that we couldn't have done any of this without you is quite literally true. So thank you for all of the work that you've put in, both visible and invisible, to bring this off. And the final note I will say of thanks is to you, the audience, for your participation, your engagement over the last 2 weeks of events. You dug in, you stuck with us, you listened, you questioned, you commented, you chatted, and hopefully we're all the better for it. So we will be seeing you all soon and next year in person. All the best.